Elena Vasquez did not choose the mountain chose her, the way grief chooses people, without asking, without warning, without any care for whether they are ready. She had packed 2 bags, not because 2 bags were enough for a life, but because a life was exactly what she was trying to leave behind. The apartment in Bucharest still had her name on the lease. Her old university office still had her diplomas on the wall. Her car, a faded blue sedan, still had the child seat in the back, from when her grandson visited last summer. She had left all of it. She had driven east and then north, into the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, until the road became too narrow for 2 cars to pass each other, and then she had driven a little further still, until the road stopped pretending to be a road, and became something more like a suggestion. The cabin had belonged to a man her former department chairman had once called a romantic fool, a man who had believed that living close to the land was the only honest way to live. He had died 3 winters ago, and his niece had been trying to sell the cabin ever since, to absolutely no one. When Elena had called, the niece had sounded so relieved that she had almost forgotten to ask for money. The cabin was made of thick pine logs, dark with age, with a single chimney that leaned slightly to the left, as if it had been listening to something for a very long time, and had tilted toward the sound. Inside, there were 2 rooms. A main room with a wood stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a shelf of books, left behind by the dead man. A bedroom, with a low wooden bed, and a window that looked directly into the forest. There was no internet. There was no phone signal. There was a well in the yard, a woodpile stacked against the east wall of the cabin, and silence so complete that Elena could hear her own heartbeat when she stood still. She was 54 years old. She had spent 30 years studying wildlife in the field, bears, lynx, deer, and most of all wolves. She had written 4 books. She had trained dozens of young biologists. She had been, by every measure that universities and scientific journals use, a success. And she had arrived at that cabin with 2 bags and a photograph, and the very specific exhaustion of a person who has given everything she had to give, and finds, at the end of it, that the giving has not filled the hole she was trying to fill. Her son Daniel had died 14 months ago. He was 29 years old, and had been driving home from a night shift at a hospital in Cluj, when another car had crossed the center line. The other driver had walked away with a broken arm. Daniel had not walked away at all. He had been gone before the ambulance arrived. In those 14 months, Elena had done what people told her to do. She had gone to therapy. She had taken the medication her doctor prescribed. She had attended the grief group on Tuesday evenings, in a room that smelled of old coffee, and was lit too brightly. She had sat across the table from her former husband George, a man she had once loved deeply, and who had become, over the years, a stranger who used her name the way a person uses a key, only when they needed something opened. The divorce had been finalized 8 months after Daniel's death. George had wanted to sell the apartment. Elena had let him. She had taken her books, her field notebooks, her hiking boots, and the photograph of Daniel that sat on her desk. The photograph showed him at 12 years old, standing at the edge of a pond in the mountains north of Cluj, holding a small green frog in both hands, grinning as if the frog were made of gold. She had been the one who found the frog. She had shown it to him carefully, told him the species, explained why it was unusually bright in color that season. He had not listened to any of the scientific explanation. He had simply been happy. Simply, completely, entirely happy, in the way that children are happy, when the world presents them with something small, and alive, and unexpected. She had put that photograph on the shelf in the cabin, next to the dead man's books, and she had stood there for a while, looking at it. Then she had gone outside, split some firewood, and made herself a cup of tea. That was September. By the time the first snow came in late October, Elena had settled into a routine that was bare and clean, and required almost no thought. She woke before dawn. She lit the stove. She made tea and ate bread, with a scraping of whatever she had brought up from the village, which was 8 kilometers down the mountain road. Once a week she walked down, bought what she needed, spoke as little as possible to the people she encountered, and walked back up again. The village was called Vama Bului. It had a small shop, a church, a bar where old men sat in the afternoons, and a population of about 300 people, who had watched Elena arrive and had been discussing her ever since. She did not mind being discussed. She had, in her career, been discussed plenty, in faculty meetings, at conferences, in the footnotes of other people's papers. Being talked about was not the same as being known, and Elena had decided, somewhere between Daniel's funeral, and the signing of her divorce papers, that she was no longer interested in being known. What she was interested in, or rather what she found herself doing simply because her body and her training demanded it, was paying attention to the forest. She had not brought her professional equipment. No field cameras, no spotting scope, no recording devices. But she had brought her eyes, and 30 years of experience had made her eyes very sharp indeed. She noticed things the way other people breathe, without deciding to, without stopping to appreciate it. She noticed the deer tracks in the mud near the stream to the east. She noticed the claw marks on the pine trees at the northern edge of her yard, too high and too deep for a domestic dog. She noticed the feathers on the ground near the woodpile, the remnants of something that had been caught and eaten in the night. She noticed the way the birds in the pines above the cabin changed their behavior on certain mornings, going quiet in a particular way, pulling their movements inward, the collective body language of creatures that sense a large predator is near. She noticed the wolves. She did not see them at first. She heard them. Long, low howls that rose from somewhere deep in the forest above the cabin, sometimes in the early evening, sometimes in the hours before dawn. They were not constant. They were not every night. But they were frequent enough that she began to expect them. And on the nights when they did not come, the silence felt heavier than usual. The absence of the sound was itself a kind of sound, a negative space that the ears moved toward and found empty. There was a pack in this part of the mountains. She had known that before she came. In her old life, she would have pulled up the official wildlife database and read everything recorded about them: population size, territory boundaries, seasonal patterns, pack structure, the year-by-year data collected by the State Wildlife Authority, and by whatever researchers had managed to get funding for field seasons in this area. But she had left that life behind, and so she knew them only as sound, as presence, as a fact of the forest, the way the pine trees were a fact of the forest, and the cold, and the dark. The villagers had more specific knowledge, as villagers always do, about the land they have lived alongside for generations. On her second visit to the shop in Vamabului, a man named Petra, heavy-set, with a gray beard, and the slow, deliberate speech of someone who had lived his entire life at altitude, had told her about the wolves while she was paying for a bag of flour. He said the pack had been in that area for over 20 years. He said they were large wolves, larger than any he had seen in photographs, and that the male who led them was the biggest of all. He said no one in the village knew exactly how old the male was, but that he had been leading the pack for at least 12 years, which was a very long time for a wolf to hold that kind of position. Most wolf males lost their leadership to younger challengers well before that. A male who had held his place for 12 years was either extraordinarily capable or extraordinarily intelligent, or both. The villagers called him Regele, which meant the king. Some of the younger people, speaking in a mixture of Romanian and the casual English that young people everywhere seem to share now, called him the Alpha King, half as a joke, and half because nothing else seemed to fit the scale of what they were describing. Elena listened to all of this with her hands folded around her bag of flour, and her expression neutral and attentive. She thanked Petra and walked back up the mountain. That evening she sat at her table after supper and opened her field notebook, a habit so deeply embedded in her that she had packed it without thinking, the way a person packs their phone charger even when they are trying to leave their old life behind. She did not write observations. She wrote nothing useful or scientific. She wrote, in small, careful letters, "They are up there. I have heard them. The old male has led them for 12 years. I wonder what he has seen." Through the window she could see the tops of the pines moving gently in the night wind, and beyond them, a slice of sky filled with more stars than she had seen since a field season in the high Apennines more than 20 years ago. She lay there for a long time, not sleeping, not thinking about Daniel exactly, but not thinking about him either. He was simply there, the way the cold was there, the way the sound of wind in the pines was there, present, inseparable from everything. She had been in the cabin for 6 weeks when she first saw Regele. It was late November. She had come outside just after dawn to bring in firewood, and she had stopped at the edge of the woodpile because something in the forest had gone still, in a way that made her own body go still too. 30 years of fieldwork do things to a person's nervous system. They teach the body to notice the quality of silence, the difference between the silence of an empty forest and the silence of a forest that is holding its breath because something large and significant is standing in it. She turned slowly toward the tree line, moving from the hips without shifting her feet, keeping her posture low and non-threatening, the way you move when you do not want to break whatever is about to happen. He was standing just inside the edge of the pines, where the morning light did not quite reach. But she could see him clearly enough. He was enormous, she had been told this, but being told and seeing were different things entirely. He was pale gray, almost silver across the shoulders, with a broad chest and a massive head that was slightly too large even for his body, the way the heads of very old males sometimes become. His eyes caught the thin winter light and reflected it back at her, golden and steady and utterly without fear. He was not threatening her. He was not crouching, not tensed, not showing his teeth. He was simply standing there, looking at her, in the straightforward way of a creature that has no reason to be ashamed of looking, and has not yet encountered a reason to be afraid. Elena stood very still. She let her arms hang loose at her sides. She kept her gaze soft, not a direct dominant stare, not a challenge, just quiet attention. She breathed slowly. She counted her breaths because it gave her something to do with the part of her mind that was not completely occupied by the fact that she was standing approximately 3 meters from the largest wild wolf she had ever seen in 30 years of fieldwork. In 30 years she had seen many wolves. She had seen them at close range, in circumstances both planned and unplanned. She had been, on 2 occasions, alone in the field when a wolf had appeared unexpectedly, at a distance of less than 10 meters. None of those experiences had felt like this. This felt like being looked at by someone who had already been looking for a long time, and had decided, at some point before this morning, what they were looking at. She reached 7 breaths. Then Regale turned his head, looked at something behind him that she could not see, and walked calmly back into the trees. Within seconds, there was no sign he had ever been there at all. The forest closed around the space where he had stood, and the birds began to move again, and the morning resumed its normal texture. Elena stood at the woodpile for a long time after that. The firewood was still in her arms. She had not moved during the entire encounter. She realized, when she finally went back inside and set the wood down beside the stove, that her hands were not shaking. She had expected them to be. But they were perfectly steady. She sat down at the table and opened her notebook. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote a careful description of what she had seen: his size, his coloring, his posture, the direction he had come from, and the direction he had gone. She noted the duration of the encounter, the distance, the weather conditions, the behavior of the surrounding birds before and after. She wrote all of it down with the precision of someone who had been trained to record exactly what she saw, and nothing more. Then, at the bottom of the page, she wrote one sentence that was not precise or scientific at all. She wrote, "He looked at me the way I look at the photograph." She stared at that sentence for a long moment. Then she turned the page and did not look at it again. December came with hard cold and long nights and snow that fell for 3 days without stopping, and made the cabin feel like the only warm thing left in the world. The wolves howled often during those weeks, long and close, the sound rolling down the ridge and finding its way through the cabin walls with an ease that surprised her. It was not a frightening sound. She had never found it frightening, even as a young researcher hearing it for the first time in the field. It was, she had always thought, one of the most honest sounds she had ever heard, completely itself, completely without pretense, carrying exactly what it carried, and nothing more. She split wood. She read the dead man's books, which turned out to be a very fine collection, poetry and natural history, and 3 novels in translation that she worked through slowly, 1 chapter each evening, making it last. She walked to the village and back, and she cooked simple meals, and she slept more soundly than she had slept in over a year. The mountain did not ask anything of her. It simply continued to be what it was, which was large and cold and indifferent and full of life. And this, she was beginning to understand, was exactly what she needed. On the last day of February, after a snowfall that had kept her inside for 3 days, and that had muffled the world so completely that she could hear the creak of the pine trees expanding and contracting in the cold, she opened the cabin door at first light. She looked down. There was a wolf pup on her doorstep. It was lying in a shallow nest of dried grass and pine needles, tucked against the lower right corner of the doorframe as if someone had placed it there, with careful, deliberate intent. It was very small. She judged it to be no more than 4 or 5 weeks old. Its fur was dark, almost charcoal gray, and its eyes were only partly open. with the unfocused milky look of a pup that had not yet fully learned how to be in the world. It was breathing. Barely, it seemed, but breathing, the tiny chest rising and falling in shallow, effortful increments. Elena stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds. Then she knelt, pulled off her outer jacket without thinking about it, and wrapped the pup in it. She brought it inside. She closed the door behind her. She set the pup near the stove, close enough to receive the heat, but not so close as to overwhelm a body that was already stressed. Then she went to the window and looked out at the tree line. The Alpha King was there, standing in exactly the same spot where she had seen him in November, where the pines met the edge of the yard. Looking at the cabin with those steady golden eyes, he was very still, as he always seemed to be. A stillness that was not the stillness of fear or caution, but the stillness of a creature that has made a decision and is waiting to see it through. Long enough that the fire in the stove caught fully, and the cabin began to warm, and the pup on the floor beside the stove stirred once and was still again. Then he turned and walked back into the trees. Elena pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window. Her palm left a print that faded slowly in the cold. She had no idea what had just happened. She had no framework for it, but she had the very clear, very certain feeling, the kind of feeling that arrives before explanation, before analysis, before any of the machinery of professional knowledge kicks in, that what had just happened was deliberate, that it had been planned, that it was the beginning of something rather than a random event, and that it was not over. She turned back to the pup wrapped in her coat. Its tiny chest rose and fell. Its nose twitched once, catching some scent that interested it even in its weakened state. Outside, the snow was still falling, soft and steady, and the forest was quiet again, keeping its own counsel in the way it always did. Elena had not planned to save anything when she came to this mountain. She had come here to do the opposite of saving, to set things down, to be still, to stop moving, and wait for the grief to do whatever it was going to do. But the pup was breathing, and the fire was warm, and her hands were already doing what they had been trained to do, long before she had any thoughts about it at all. Some instincts, it turned out, do not care what you planned. The pup was a male. Elena knew this within the first hour of handling him, but it was not the most important thing she learned in those first hours. The most important thing she learned was that he was cold in a way that went deeper than the skin, the kind of bone-deep chill that sets into a small creature that has been lying still for too long in air that is many degrees below freezing. His gums, when she gently parted his lips to check them, were pale. Not white, not the flat catastrophic white of a body that has lost too much blood or warmth, but pale enough that she understood the situation was serious. His limbs were loose. He did not cry. He simply lay in the fold of her jacket and breathed in shallow, effortful increments, as if breathing itself was a negotiation he was conducting with his body, one breath at a time. Elena had not treated a wolf pup in many years, but the knowledge did not leave a person the way a phone number leaves you when you stop dialing it. It sat in her hands. It lived in the muscle memory of her palms and fingertips, in the specific angle at which she had learned to hold a small animal, in the instinctive reading of weight and temperature and muscle tone that 30 years of handling creatures in various states of distress had built into her as completely as language. She moved without hesitating. She warmed water on the stove, not hot, not even warm by human standards, just enough to take the worst of the cold off it, the kind of temperature that does not shock a chilled body but begins, gently, to coax it back. She soaked a strip of clean cloth in it and used it to wipe the pup's face and paws, warming the skin in small areas at a time, never applying the warmth all at once, careful not to cause the rapid change in circulation that can send a cold-shocked body into crisis. She set a dry cloth beneath him to keep him off the floor. She positioned him close enough to the stove that the radiated warmth reached him in a steady drift rather than a blast. She checked his breathing every few minutes, placing her fingertip lightly against his side and counting, and spoke to him in a low, even voice the entire time. She had emergency supplies in a small kit she had packed from Bucharest, packed it entirely from habit, from the professional reflex that makes a field biologist carry certain things automatically, the way a person carries their keys. She had set the kit on the shelf beside Daniel's photograph without opening it, and had not thought about it again for the months she had been here. She opened it now. Inside was a small bottle of electrolyte solution, designed for newborn animals, 2 syringes without needles, a thermometer, a roll of soft bandage, antiseptic, and a pair of thin latex gloves. She put on the gloves. She checked the pup's temperature. Low, but not at the extreme she had feared. Low enough to be a serious concern. Not so low that the situation was already beyond her. She drew a small amount of the electrolyte solution into a syringe and let a few drops fall carefully onto the pup's tongue, watching to make sure he swallowed. She waited. She watched his throat move. She gave him a little more. This went on for the better part of the morning. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The world beyond her window was white and gray, and still, and entirely indifferent to what was happening in the cabin. And inside the cabin, by the warm stove, Elena sat on the floor with the wolf pup in her lap, and worked in the slow, precise way of someone who has done difficult and careful things for a very long time. She had sat like this, in field camps in 3 countries. She had sat like this, beside injured animals she had found in the course of her research, and could not in good conscience walk away from. She had sat like this with Daniel, when he was small and sick with winter fevers, her hand on his forehead, her voice low and steady, her attention entirely on the one thing in front of her. She did not think about Daniel now. She thought about the pup. She let herself be completely in the work, the way she had learned, very early in her career, that the work requires. Divided attention is no attention at all when you are trying to keep something small and fragile alive. By noon, the pup was warmer. She could feel it, the change in the way his weight settled against her, a quality of loosening, of the body coming back to itself from somewhere far away. His breathing had deepened slightly, which was a good sign. His eyes, when they opened, still had the glassy quality of a pup this young, but they moved in response to light, which was better than they had been in the morning. She ate standing up, at the counter, a piece of bread and cold soup from the previous night, not taking her eyes off him for more than a few seconds at a time. She had set him in a shallow wooden box she found under the bed, and lined with the softest cloth she owned, one of her old thermal underlayers, long past wearing but too soft to throw away, and positioned the box 2 feet from the stove. She checked him every 15 minutes through the afternoon. In the late afternoon, when the light went gray and the temperature outside dropped, she stood at her window for a long time. The tree line was dark. Regale was not visible. She had not expected him to be. Wolves with any experience of human proximity do not stay near human dwellings in the daylight when they do not have to. But she found herself looking anyway, the way you look for something you have no particular reason to expect and yet somehow expect anyway. She thought about what had happened that morning. She had been studying wolves for most of her adult life. She knew the documented behaviors. She knew what packs do with pups that are compromised, what the mathematics of survival require. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that what had happened on her doorstep that morning was not a thing that appeared in any field guide or research paper she had ever read. A pup had not been abandoned. Abandoned pups were left where they fell, in the den, in the snow along a trail, wherever the weakness became apparent. They were not carried to a specific location. They were not placed in a nest of carefully arranged dried grass, at the door of a specific person, by a wolf who had been watching that person for months. She did not let herself say this out loud. She had spent 30 years in science, and science had made her deeply suspicious of the stories she wanted to believe. It was too easy, with animals, to read intention where there was only coincidence, to project human reasoning onto behavior that had simpler explanations. It was one of the central disciplines of her field, resisting the narrative your own mind wanted to construct. But she was also a woman who had spent 30 years watching animals, and something in her, not the scientist, but the person who had listened to wolves howl above her cabin for months, was quite certain that the morning had been deliberate. She made herself write in her notebook, sat at the table after the pup took another small amount of electrolyte, and fell into something that looked like real sleep, and wrote it all down in the careful, neutral language of her training. Date, time, weather conditions, description of the pup, sex, estimated age, weight approximated by handling, coat color and condition, temperature reading, gum color on arrival, treatment administered, response observed. She wrote it all, and at the end she wrote one additional line. She wrote, "I do not yet know what this is, but I am paying attention." The next morning, snow or no snow, she walked down to Vamabului. The path was deep, with fresh white, and the air was the kind of cold that makes the inside of the nose ache, and it took her over an hour to cover the 8 kilometers. She bought supplies. A proper milk replacer was beyond what the small village shop stocked, but she found a powdered formula meant for young lambs that would serve, and more of the electrolyte solution, and a tin of the kind of soft, high-fat food she could supplement with for the weeks ahead. She also spoke to Petra. She told him what she had found on her doorstep. She kept it brief and factual. Petre listened with his hands flat on the counter, and his expression the careful, unsurprised expression of a mountain man who had lived beside the forest long enough to have stopped being surprised by it, and had developed instead a deep and patient attention to its communications. When she finished, he said, "Regally." Not a question. Elena nodded. Petre looked at her for a moment, then out the window at the gray sky, then back at her. He said, "My grandfather used to say that the wolves in these mountains see more than we give them credit for. He was not a man who said foolish things." She bought her supplies and walked back up the mountain. She thought about what Petra had said, not because it was scientific, it was not scientific at all, but because it was the kind of observation that sat beside the scientific evidence without contradicting it, and that sometimes, in her experience, the thing that sat beside the evidence said something the evidence alone could not yet say. 3 days after the pup arrived, he drank from a shallow bowl for the first time. He put his whole muzzle in, pulled back sneezing, tried again with more caution, and managed to take a real amount of the warmed formula. Elena watched this with the focused attention of someone witnessing something that required witnessing. When he had finished, she sat back on her heels and felt something shift in her chest. She had not given herself permission to name him. She had been telling herself he was a research subject, that naming him was a trap she was not going to fall into, that the whole situation required exactly the kind of clinical distance that 30 years of professional work had given her. She told herself this several times. And then she called him Mike, which was just the Romanian word for small, and told herself it was a working name only, a temporary label, and knew as she said it that she was not telling herself the truth. On the 5th night, she reached over in the firelight and touched his small gray ear, very gently, with one finger. He stirred, but did not wake. Outside, from somewhere high on the ridge above the cabin, a single long howl rose and fell and dissolved into the cold night air. Elena sat very still. She listened until the forest was quiet again. Then she picked up her notebook and wrote the date and the time and the observation. At the bottom of the entry she wrote, "He is checking." She closed the notebook. She sat in the warmth of the stove with the small gray pup sleeping beside her in his lined box, and the mountain outside held the dark the way it always did, without effort, without end, holding everything in it without preference or judgment. The cabin and the pines and the wolves on the ridge and whatever was going to happen next, all of it held equally in the dark. She had been making a list, without realizing it, of the things she had not expected when she came to this mountain. She had not expected to sleep well. She had not expected the cold to feel clean rather than punishing. She had not expected to find that the absence of a telephone signal was, after the first week, a relief rather than an inconvenience. She had not expected to become interested in the dead man's books. She had not expected the smell of pine resin in cold air to become, within 2 months, one of the smells she most associated with something close to peace. And she had not expected this. A wolf pup in a box beside the stove, and an old silver wolf checking on the cabin from the tree line, and her own hands moving with a sureness she had not felt in over a year, doing the work she had been trained to do, one small, careful step at a time. Mike grew steadily through the first week. Each morning she measured him, not with instruments she did not have, but with her hands and eyes, the accumulated precision of decades, noting the changes in weight and tone and alertness with the same reliability as any device. His temperature normalized on the 4th day. On the 5th day he moved with intention rather than reflex. On the 6th day, when she came to him in the morning, he lifted his head toward the sound of her footsteps before she reached the box. That, more than anything else, told her he was going to be all right. She had kept her field notebooks for 30 years, and could not have stopped if she tried. Every evening she sat at the table and recorded the day's observations in the precise, unornamented language of her training. Weight estimated, temperature taken, food volume consumed, behavior noted. She wrote it as carefully as she had written the papers that appeared in journals, the reports that went to wildlife authorities, the grant applications that she had spent months of her life constructing. She wrote it with the same seriousness, which surprised her slightly, because she had no audience. There was no journal here. There was no authority she was accountable to. There was only the pup in the box, and the wolf in the trees, and the notebook, and the cold. And yet she wrote every word with her full attention, because the attention was the only thing she had entirely under her own control, and she had decided, without articulating it as a decision, that she was going to give it completely to what was in front of her. This was not a decision she had made about her grief. She had not woken up one morning and chosen to be present and engaged with her life. That was not how it worked, and anyone who told you it was, had either not experienced real loss, or had forgotten what it felt like. It was that a pup was breathing. It was that a temperature needed to be checked. It was that a bowl needed to be warmed, and a cloth needed to be rinsed, and a set of small observations needed to be written down before she forgot them. And in doing those things, one after another, the hours passed. And the hours becoming days was not healing, exactly. But it was something. It was the thing that came before healing, the scaffolding under which healing could eventually happen, if it was going to happen. On the 8th day, Mike climbed out of his box for the first time. He did not go far. He took 4 unsteady steps onto the cabin floor, sat down abruptly because his legs were not yet entirely his to command, looked around the room with an expression of alert bewilderment, and then sat there regarding Elena with the complete and total attention of a creature that has decided, on very limited evidence, to trust something. Elena sat on the floor across from him. They looked at each other for a while. She said, "All right, here we are." He tilted his head at the sound of her voice, the way pups do when a sound strikes them as worth investigating. Then he got to his feet with more confidence than he had managed the first time, and walked toward her with the rolling, effortful gait of something that is operating its legs largely by determination, and sat down directly in front of her and looked up at her face. She set her hand down on the floor in front of him, palm up. He sniffed it. He licked it once, briefly and with great seriousness. Then he turned around and walked back to his box and stepped into it and lay down and went to sleep. Elena stayed on the floor for a while after that. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines in the slow, steady way it had at this altitude. Not gusting, just persistent, as if it had somewhere else to be and was passing through. She thought about Daniel, who would have been on the floor too, and would have been much less restrained than she was, and would have already thought of 6 questions she had not thought of yet. She thought about the way he used to say, in the field when she was teaching him to observe, that the hardest part was not seeing the animal. The hardest part was seeing the animal without deciding in advance what it meant. She had spent his whole childhood correcting that instinct in herself, and trying to teach the discipline to him. And here she was, sitting on a cabin floor in the Carpathian Mountains, with a wolf pup who had just licked her hand, trying to decide what it meant. She laughed, alone in the cabin, with no one to hear it. She laughed quietly at herself, at the situation, at the absolute impossibility of having predicted, when she had driven up this mountain in September, that this was where she was going to end up. It was the first time she had laughed in 14 months. She noticed that. She wrote it down, later, in the notebook. Not in the section with the pup's measurements and observations, but in a separate page at the back, where she kept the things that were not scientific, but that needed to be recorded anyway. The second pup arrived on a Wednesday, 11 days after the first. Elena knew it was Wednesday, only because she had started marking the days in her notebook, not for any professional reason, but because the days had begun to feel so alike that she had lost track of 1 or 2 of them in January, and had felt, briefly, as if she were floating untethered from the week, which was an uncomfortable feeling that she had not anticipated and could not fully explain. Marking the days was a way of anchoring herself, of saying, this day happened, and then this day, and the days form a line, and the line goes somewhere, even if she was not yet certain where. So she knew it was Wednesday when she stepped outside just after 7 in the morning, in the gray early light of mid-March, and found the second pup. This one was different from Mick in almost every respect. Where Mick had been dark gray and frightening in his stillness, this pup was lighter in color, almost tawny, a warm brown gray that caught even the low March light, and it was not still at all. It was huddled against the base of the doorframe with its whole body pressed into the wood. But when Elena opened the door, it lifted its head with startling speed and looked at her with bright, frightened, fully present eyes. Then it made a sound she would describe in her notebook as halfway between a protest and a declaration. This was a pup with opinions about its situation. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked out at the tree line. The Alpha King was there. As before. Exactly as before. Same spot at the western edge of the pines. Same posture. The same deep, unhurried watchfulness. He stood in the shadow of the trees, with his massive head raised, and those amber gold eyes fixed on the cabin, and he did not move. He was watching her receive the pup. That was the only way she could think of it. He was watching to make sure she received it. Elena stood in the doorway in her boots, and the cold March air hit her, and she looked at the wolf, and the wolf looked at her, and something passed between them that she did not have scientific language for, and had stopped pretending otherwise. Then she knelt down and picked up the tawny pup. He was heavier than Mike had been on the first morning, healthier overall, warmer, more alert. But his left foreleg was wrong, in a way she felt immediately upon lifting him, before her eyes had confirmed what her hands already knew. The leg turned inward at the knee joint, in a way that did not match the right leg. Not broken, not injured, structural. Something in the development of the joint itself. A malformation that had been present since before birth, most likely. The kind of thing that announces itself early and does not change. She carried him inside and laid him on the table and examined him with the lamp positioned above. He cried the entire time, a thin, continuously affronted sound that expressed in equal measure both real discomfort and the strong personal feeling that he should not be in a situation where he was being handled by a stranger. She spoke to him steadily. She kept her movements slow and consistent, giving him the chance to anticipate each one. She turned the affected leg with great care, assessed the angle of deviation, worked through the range of motion joint by joint, pressed gently at the knee to feel for heat or swelling. There was no acute pain response. The malformation was old, structural, without current inflammation. But it was significant. A wolf with that leg, trying to keep pace with a pack in winter hunting conditions, would struggle. A pup with that leg, competing for food with healthy siblings, would consistently lose. She set him in a second box beside Mike's, lined with soft cloth, near the stove. Mike woke up, raised his head, sniffed the air with great concentration, and made a small sound of interest. The tawny pup sniffed back from his box with equal concentration. Within an hour, they had both fallen asleep, with their noses pointed toward the gap between the boxes, their small bodies oriented toward each other's warmth and scent. Elena sat at the table and held her coffee, and looked at them, and thought. She had been resisting the obvious conclusion, because she was a scientist, and scientists do not reach for the obvious conclusion until the evidence compels them. But 2 pups in 11 days, each delivered before dawn, each with a specific condition that made them a burden to the pack, each announced by the presence of regulae at the tree line. This was not a pattern she could attribute to coincidence without doing violence to her own professional standards. Coincidence is a real thing. It happens. Random events cluster in ways that look meaningful. One of the central disciplines of fieldwork was resisting the pattern-seeking tendency of the human mind, which is very good at finding patterns, and not always equally good at distinguishing the real ones from the ones it has constructed. But 2 was not 1. 11 days apart was not random timing, and the grass-lined nest beneath each pup was not something that happened by accident. Nests required construction. Someone had gathered the dried grass and the pine needles and arranged them beneath the pup before leaving it at her door. Someone had done this deliberately, carefully, with the specific intention of providing insulation for the short time between delivery and collection. She opened her notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she did something she had not done since graduate school, which was to write a hypothesis before she had finished gathering the evidence to test it. She wrote, "Regulae is removing from the pack the pups it cannot sustain, and is bringing them here. He has assessed this location as viable for their survival. He has assessed me as capable of managing them." She looked at what she had written. She was aware of how it sounded. She was aware that if she shared this hypothesis with any of her colleagues in its current form, without the evidence that would support it, she would receive a great deal of polite and not so polite skepticism. She was aware that what she was suggesting, that an old wild wolf had observed a human being for months, assessed her capabilities, and made a series of deliberate decisions about bringing her compromised pups, was the kind of claim that required a very high standard of evidence to stand in the literature. She was also aware that she had been standing in the snow outside her cabin that morning, watching the oldest wolf she had ever seen look at her while she held his pup, and that the looking had contained something she did not have a scientific word for, and was not going to pretend she did not see. She drew a line beneath the hypothesis, and began to write the observational notes. The tawny pup was named Stramb, which meant crooked, which was not a kind name but was an accurate one, and he accepted it as he accepted everything, loudly, with opinions, with an energy that made it impossible to feel sorry for him, even when you knew about the leg. He was the most demanding of the two pups by a significant margin. He wanted to eat when he decided it was time, which was often. He wanted to be handled when he decided it was appropriate, which was also often. He explored his box with a methodical thoroughness that reminded Elena of the young researchers who impressed her most, the ones who could not simply observe a thing, but had to understand all of its edges. His leg did not seem to trouble him the way she had feared it might. He moved with compensations that were already becoming automatic, already becoming his body's native way of navigating the world rather than a response to a problem. She watched this adaptation with the careful attention of a researcher and something else alongside it, something warmer and less clinical, that she did not write in the scientific section of her notes but that was present nonetheless. In the nights that followed, Regele appeared at the tree line twice more, not for long, not approaching, just present for a few minutes in the dark at the edge of the yard, and then gone. He came on the fourth night after the second delivery, and again on the eighth. She could not always see him clearly in the dark, but on the eighth night, there was enough moon that she caught him clearly from her bedroom window, standing in his usual place, looking at the cabin. She opened the window. The cold rushed in. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them moved for a long time. Then she closed the window and went back to bed, and lay there for a while in the dark, with the sound of two pups breathing softly from the other room, and thought about what it meant that she was no longer afraid. She had not been afraid of him since the first morning. She was not certain why. She had been in the field with large predators many times, and had felt appropriate caution, the healthy wariness that kept you alive. With Regula she felt something else entirely, something closer to the feeling of being in the presence of someone who means you no harm, and who has already demonstrated this clearly enough that your nervous system has simply accepted it. She wrote this in the notebook, in the back pages, in the section that was not for scientific observations. She wrote it without apology and without qualification, because if she was going to be honest with herself out here in the middle of the mountains with no one watching, she might as well be honest. The third pup arrived exactly 11 days after the second. She had been half expecting it, not in a way she would have defended in a scientific paper, but in the way the body builds expectations when a pattern has established itself, and the body, which is an extraordinarily good pattern recognition system, knows this even before the conscious mind has caught up. She had started leaving the lantern on low through the nights. She had started waking more easily at dawn, roused by any sound near the door. She had positioned Make's and Stramb's boxes slightly away from the door to clear the space in front of it. On the morning the third pup arrived, she was already at the window when the light came. She saw Regella at the tree line before she even looked at the doorstep. And when she opened the door, the third pup was there, a small dark female, smaller than either of the previous two, curled against the doorframe, with a stillness that was concerning, until she heard, immediately upon bending down to her, the faint but distinct sound of each breath, a wet, rattling quality, just slightly wrong, the early signature of a respiratory infection working its way into the small lungs. She looked up at Regally. He looked back at her. 3, she said quietly, into the cold. She brought the pup inside, and closed the door behind her, and began again. The third pup was the most medically challenging of the three so far. The respiratory infection was not yet severe. It was early, which was both the good news and the complicated news, because early meant she still had the chance to manage it before it deepened, but early also meant it would worsen before it improved, and she had limited resources in a cabin 8 kilometers from the nearest village, and no vehicle and weather that could close the mountain road at any time. She borrowed a stethoscope from the village nurse on her next supply run, a woman named Oana, who was the only medical professional within 20 kilometers, and who handed over the instrument with the practical generosity of someone used to making do with what was available. Oana did not ask many questions about why a retired wildlife biologist living alone in a mountain cabin needed a stethoscope. She asked enough to satisfy herself that no one was in immediate danger, and that Elena knew how to use the instrument, which Elena demonstrably did, and then she gave it, and said to bring it back when she was done with it. Elena used it twice daily after that, The sounds in the small chest were the sounds she did not want to hear at first, the wet crackle that told her the infection was settling in. And then, after 4 days of the treatment regimen she had built from the resources she had, they began to change. The crackling became less liquid, the breaths came easier. On the 7th day she listened and heard something closer to clear, not perfectly clear but moving in the right direction, and she let out a breath she had not quite realized she had been holding for a week. She named the third pup Micah, the feminine form of Mick. Small female. Not a very imaginative name, but an honest one. And honesty felt like the right approach in a situation that was asking for it at every turn. She called Micah small female in her notes, and spoke to her in the low, steady voice she used for all of them, and sat with her in the evenings wrapped in a cloth by the stove, and Mick and Stram would come and push their noses against the edge of the box with great interest, and then be redirected. Because what Micah needed most was warmth and stillness and rest, and what Mike and Stram were best at providing was energy and curiosity, and the persistent belief that whatever was in the box should be shared with them. In those weeks, as the third pup recovered, Elena became aware of something shifting in the cabin. The shift was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift you notice only when you are paying attention, which she was. She was paying more attention than she had paid to anything in over a year. And the attention had a quality to it that she recognized from the best seasons of her career, when she was in the field and the work was going well, and the research was alive, and she was entirely inside it. The quality of being absorbed, of having something real to give your concentration to, and giving it completely. The grief did not go away. It was not replaced or crowded out, but it moved. It moved from the foreground, where it had been living for 14 months, the thing she walked into first every morning, the thing that colored everything she looked at, and it moved to somewhere beside her. Still there, still heavy, but beside her rather than in front of her, which meant she could see past it to the other things that were also true. The pups were one of the other things that were true. The mountain was another. The silence on nights when the wind dropped was another. The specific satisfaction of a body of work well done, the careful treatment, the twice-daily stethoscope checks, the precise warming and feeding and observation, was another. She wrote a long letter to Dr. Mihai Oros in Bucharest one evening, after all 3 pups had been fed and settled. She wrote it in the careful, measured language of a scientist, but she allowed herself, at the end, to be honest about what she was seeing and what she thought it might mean. She sealed it and carried it down to the village and asked Petra to post it, and walked back up the mountain thinking about what Mihai would say when he read it, whether he would think she had been alone too long and was seeing things, whether the professional distance she had always valued in herself was still available to her here. She thought she knew what was happening. She was not certain. She was never certain until the evidence compelled certainty, and she had not yet accumulated enough of it. But the shape of what was happening was becoming clearer with each morning that came, and the shape was extraordinary, and she was not going to pretend otherwise, just to protect herself from seeming unscientific. That was not who she was, and the mountain had made her more herself, not less. Outside, that night, Regale appeared at the tree line, at 11 minutes past 9, and stood there for 6 minutes exactly, which Elena timed from her window, and then walked back into the pines. He came every few nights now, checking, always checking, and Elena stood at the window and watched him check, and something between them, whatever it was, across the gap of species and language, and the fundamental differentness of their respective natures, held. She did not know yet what to call it. But it held. The village of Vama Buliwi had survived for several centuries by paying attention to what the mountain did and adjusting accordingly. The people there were not superstitious in the dramatic way that outsiders sometimes imagined mountain people to be. They did not believe in curses or spirits, for the most part. What they believed in was pattern. They believed that if you watched closely enough and long enough, the mountain would show you what it intended, and that it was wise to pay careful attention to that showing, and unwise to argue with it. By the time Elena walked down to the village for her regular supply run in the last week of March, the story of what was happening at her cabin had already spread through the community, in the particular way that stories spread in small places, not through gossip exactly, which implies a kind of carelessness about accuracy, but through the natural circulation of important information in a community where most people had known each other their entire lives, and where news of any kind was both welcome and taken seriously. She became aware of this the moment she stepped through the door of the shop. Pitre was behind the counter, as always. But there were two other people in the shop who had no obvious purchasing purpose. A woman, in her late 30s named Lucia, who Elena had spoken to briefly once before, and an older man she had not met, who stood near the window with his arms folded across his chest, in the particular manner of someone who has positioned himself to observe and intends to use the observation. Pitre greeted her by name and asked about the pups with a directness that told her he had already shared what she had told him and had been waiting for an update. Elena told him there were now 3, and that the third had a chest infection that was improving. Lucia, from across the shop, said her cousin had heard it was 2. Elena said it had been 2 and was now 3. Lucia nodded with the expression of someone who has had a suspicion confirmed. The older man by the window made a sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, and was entirely deliberate. Elena looked at him. He had a broad, deeply weathered face, and pale eyes the color of mountain sky in February. Light gray, without warmth, entirely steady. He was perhaps 70. He had the hands of a man who had worked outdoors for most of his life. "That is Gheorghe," Petra said. "He was village elder here for 20 years. Retired now." "Still watching," Gheorghe said, without moving from the window. Elena faced him. She recognized the type immediately. Not because she knew this particular man, but because she had met versions of him in every mountain community she had ever worked in Romania and elsewhere. A man who had watched the land his entire life and had accumulated a kind of knowledge about it that was different from scientific knowledge in its method, but not necessarily in its accuracy. A man who took things seriously and did not waste words. "I would like to hear what you know about the pack," she said. He looked at her for a moment with those pale eyes, then he nodded once, which seemed to be enough preliminary, and began. He had lived in the valley for 71 years. He had watched the wolf pack that occupied the upper mountain for all of those years, as his father had watched the previous pack, and his father's father before that. He said that in all of that time, across all of those generations, no wolf from that pack had ever approached a human dwelling. Not during the hard winters, when prey was scarce, and the pack might have been expected to take greater risks. Not during the periods of territorial pressure when other packs pushed against the boundaries of this one's range, not ever. The pack's relationship with the humans in the valley was one of parallel existence, mutual awareness maintained at a careful distance, the mountain large enough for both. He said the male had been leading for at least 12 years. He described him without being asked to. The size, the silver coloring, the scars on the muzzle from a territorial confrontation 8 or 9 years ago, that people in the village had heard but not seen. He said Regale was the name the old people used. He said his father had called the wolf before this one by the same title, though that one had been darker in color. It was not a name for an individual, he explained. It was a title for whoever held the position. Then he said, "But I want to know what you are." It was a blunt question, asked with a directness that was not rudeness, but was not politeness either. It was the question of a man who had been watching the mountain for 71 years and had just encountered a data point he needed to place correctly in order to understand what was happening. Elena said, "I am a wildlife biologist. I spent 30 years in this field. Wolves were my primary area of study for the last 15 of those years." Gheorghe considered this. He said, "And before you came here?" She said, "Grieving." The shop was very quiet for a moment. Petra looked at the counter. Lucia looked at the shelf behind Elena. Gheorghe looked at her with those pale, steady eyes, and did not look away. He said, "My wife has been dead for 9 years. In the first years after she died, the dogs in the village behaved differently around me. Not all of them, the old ones, the ones that had lived long enough to know the smell of grief." He paused. "I do not mean this literally. I mean that grief changes something about a person in a way that animals can recognize. Something in the body goes quiet, that is usually loud. Something stops broadcasting." Elena said nothing. "Regella is very old," Gheorghe continued. "In all my years, I have not seen his equal in this area, in size or in the duration of his leadership. An old wolf who does something he has never done before is not doing it carelessly. He is doing it because he has decided it is necessary. He unfolded his arms. He chose you. Whatever the reason, he chose you specifically." Lucia said quietly, "Can we see the pups sometime?" "Not yet," Elena said. "They are not ready for visitors." She paid for her supplies. At the door, Georgi said, without looking up from where he had resettled by the window. The third pup. The one with the chest. Keep her warm at night. Mountain infections go down before they come up. Elena paused. I will, she said. She walked back up the mountain, carrying her supplies and the conversation. She thought about Georgi's description of grief, changing the way animals read a person. She thought about whether there was any scientific literature to support that observation, and came up with 2 papers she half remembered from a veterinary behavior conference she had attended nearly 20 years ago. Papers on stress hormone profiles in recently bereaved animal owners and their effects on the behavior of their animals. The evidence had been suggestive rather than conclusive, but suggestive was not nothing. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, whether the word was even accurate, whether it was the kind of word that could be applied to what an old wolf did when he carried his compromised pups to a particular cabin and waited at the tree line to see them received. She thought about all the ways the word could be wrong and all the ways it could be right, and decided she was not going to resolve it on a mountain path in the March cold, and kept walking. Back at the cabin, she opened the door, and 3 pups lifted their heads in their boxes. Mike's was up first, alert and interested. Stram's came up second, slower, assessing. Micah's came up last, still slow with the infection, but up. Elena set down her pack. She went to each of them in turn and checked them, speaking as she did. She refreshed the water bowls. She warmed the formula. She sat on the floor while they ate and wrote in her notebook with her back against the stove. And outside the afternoon went dark around the cabin, and the pines moved in the wind on the ridge, and the mountain continued to hold everything in it, with complete indifference to what any of it meant. She had begun to find the indifference comforting. It was the opposite of the grief support she had been offered in Bucharest, which was full of meaning and intention, and the earnest conviction that everything could be worked through if you applied the right methods. The mountain offered nothing. It simply continued to be itself, and somehow in that continuation there was room for her to be herself too, whatever that currently amounted to, without any requirement to explain or improve or recover on a schedule. She wrote that in her notebook, in the back pages, in the section that was not for scientific observations. She also, that evening, wrote a second letter to Mihai, shorter than the first. She wrote, I think he knows I am here. I think he has known since early autumn. I think this was not an accident. I am not yet ready to say more than that, but I want someone to know I am thinking it. She sealed the letter. She would take it down with the next supply run. Outside, later that night, Regula came to the tree line and stood there for 11 minutes while the pines moved around him and the cabin glowed warm against the dark, and Elena sat at the table with her notebook open and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was in exactly the right place. Not because it was comfortable, not because it was easy, but because it was where something real was happening, and being present to something real was, she was coming to understand, the most fundamental thing a person could do with the hours of their life. The days that followed had a different texture to them than the days before the pups. Before the pups, time had passed at the pace of grief, which was to say, it passed slowly, and without much differentiation. Each day, very much like the one before it, the hours a kind of gray continuity, that she moved through rather than inhabited. After the pups, time had the texture of work, dense, specific, full of small events that required her attention and responded to it. Micah's morning temperature, Stram's attempts to escape his box, which became more sophisticated daily and required increasingly creative countermeasures. Mike's growing confidence, and the way he had begun to test the edges of his world, nosing at the lower shelf of the bookcase, pressing his nose against the cold of the window glass, trying repeatedly to reach the stove, which Elena redirected with a patient consistency that he met with equally patient persistence. She had not lived with animals in many years. She had studied them. She had observed them in the field and handled them in research contexts and cared for them in the occasional wildlife emergency. But she had not had animals in her home since she and George had lived in the countryside near Sinaia for 5 years, in the middle of their marriage, when they had kept 2 dogs and a vegetable garden, and had been, as far as she could now reconstruct, something close to happy. Living with animals in a small space was a different kind of intimacy than studying them. It required a different quality of attention, not the observational attention of the field researcher, which was largely visual and kept a certain distance, but something more physical and relational, and without boundaries. A pup did not care whether you had observations to record. A pup cared about warmth and food, and the sound of a voice it trusted, and the smell of the person it had decided was its person, and it communicated these priorities continuously, and without restraint. Elena found this, to her considerable surprise, genuinely comforting, not in any dramatic way, not as a replacement for anything she had lost, but in the simple, physical way that living things comfort each other by being present and warm and real. She had written Mihai a third letter by the time his reply to the first two arrived, carried up the mountain by Petra's nephew on a Saturday morning, in a small envelope that had clearly been opened and resealed, which Elena chose not to notice. The letter was 6 pages long, which was long for Mihai, who was a precise and economical writer. It was the length of a man who had a great deal to say, and was being careful about how he said it. He said he believed her. He said that was not something he said lightly, and that he was saying it not as a friend giving comfort, but as a scientist looking at her description of the evidence and finding it internally consistent, specific, and not easily explained by any simpler hypothesis. He said he wanted to come and see for himself. He said he was going to bring trail cameras. He said he thought there might be a paper in this, and that if there was, it was going to be one of the more significant papers either of them had been involved with in their careers. He also said, at the end, "Elena, I am glad you are there. I am glad this is happening to you." Is that a strange thing to say? I think it is probably a strange thing to say, but I mean it. She read that paragraph twice, and then folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went outside to split wood, which was the thing she did when she needed to be in her body and not in her thoughts. The axe came down in the cold air with a clean, satisfying sound. The wood split along its grain and fell apart. She worked for an hour, until there was a good pile built against the wall, and then she stood in the yard in the late afternoon light, with her hands warm inside her gloves and the cold on her face, and looked up at the ridge. She said, "He is coming, apparently." No one was there to hear it. The tree line was empty, but she said it anyway, because it felt like the right thing to do, which was a feeling she had learned to trust more than she used to. The morning Mihai was due to arrive, Elena woke before 4 and could not sleep again. She lay in the dark and listened to the pups breathing in the other room, and to the wind in the pines, and to the silence between those sounds, which had its own texture now, its own weight. She had been here 6 months, and the silence had become readable to her in a way she had not expected, the way a language becomes readable once you have spent enough time inside it. She got up and made tea, and sat at the table with her notebook, and wrote for 2 hours. She wrote the full account of everything that had happened since September, not in the compressed, precise language of the scientific notes she had been keeping, but in the longer, slower language of someone trying to understand something by describing it completely. She wrote about arriving in September. She wrote about hearing the wolves for the first time. She wrote about the morning in November when Regale had stood at the tree line and looked at her. She wrote about the first pup, and the second, and the third, and about what it had felt like to stand in the cold doorway each time, and understand that something deliberate was happening, and not know yet what to call it. She wrote about Daniel. She had not written about him in months, not since those first weeks when the writing had been part of the raw early phase of grief, and had gone onto the page the way a wound bleeds, not carefully, not with any intent toward understanding, just because that was what happened when the pressure became too great. This writing was different. This writing looked at Daniel from a distance it had not had before, the way you look at a mountain from a distance and can see its shape complete, in a way that is impossible when you are standing at its base. She wrote, "He would have sat on the floor with them immediately. He would have had all 3 of them in his lap within 10 minutes, and he would have been completely unbothered by the impracticality of this. He would have said, 'Mum, you are allowed to let yourself love things, you know.' He used to say that to me. I used to find it irritating. I was wrong to find it irritating. I would give a great deal to find it irritating again." She closed the notebook. She looked at the photograph on the shelf. The boy with the frog. The uncomplicated joy of it. "Mihai is coming," she said to the photograph. "He is going to think this is remarkable. You would have agreed with him. You always agreed with remarkable things." Outside, the first gray of dawn was beginning in the east. She put more wood in the stove. She went to check on the pups. Mike lifted his head when she came in, bright-eyed even at this hour. Stram was awake too, watching her with the composed attention he brought to everything. Micah was still sleeping, her breathing clear and even, the infection fully gone now. her small dark chest rising and falling without effort. Elena stood in the doorway between the two rooms and looked at the three of them, and felt, without trying to name it or contain it, or make it into something presentable, the full weight of gratitude. Dr. Mihai Oros arrived on a Saturday afternoon in the first week of April, having taken the overnight train from Bucharest to the nearest city, and then a bus, and then a taxi, that the driver had been unwilling to take all the way up the mountain road after the first 3 kilometers, on the grounds that the road did not deserve the name, and that his vehicle did not deserve what the road would do to it. Mihai had carried his equipment the remaining 2 kilometers on foot, which was not ideal for a man of 51, who spent most of his working hours in a university office, but which he had managed by the simple expedient of stopping often and looking at the forest while he caught his breath, and telling himself this was observation rather than exhaustion. He arrived at the cabin door with a bag of trail cameras and a bag of specialist food supplies, and the barely contained eagerness of a man who has spent 2 weeks reading and rereading a series of letters that described something he had never encountered in 18 years of wolf research, and has been thinking about almost nothing else since. When Elena opened the door and he saw the 3 pups in their boxes by the stove, he stopped speaking mid-sentence about the taxi driver, and stood in the doorway with his mouth slightly open for a full 10 seconds. Then he said, very quietly, "Elena, come inside," she said. He came inside. He dropped his bags on the floor and knelt beside the boxes and looked at each pup with the concentrated, absorptive attention of a man whose professional life had prepared him to understand what he was looking at, but whose personal response was operating slightly ahead of his professional one. He looked at Mike, now large and bright-eyed and clearly full of opinions about this new visitor. He looked at Stram, who regarded him with the composed assessment that was Stram's characteristic response to anything new. He looked at Micah, who was watching him with the alert interest of a pup who had recently discovered that the world contained more things than a box and a stove and 2 brothers, and who was currently cataloging this new thing. Mihai sat back on his heels. He looked at Elena. He said, "Tell me everything from the beginning, nothing paraphrased." She sat across from him and told him. She had told the story to herself many times in her notebooks, and once in the full written version she had produced in the early morning hours. But telling it to another person was different. It required selection and sequence. It required her to decide what was relevant and what was the telling detail, and what she was certain of, versus what she was inferring. This was, she recognized, the same cognitive process as writing a paper, and it had the same effect. It showed her where her thinking was solid, and where it had gaps. The gaps were in the mechanism. She could describe what Regale had done with complete confidence. She had observed it, documented it, and cross-referenced each observation against her previous work and the broader literature. What she could not fully describe was the why, the internal process, whatever it was, that had produced this behavior, in this particular animal, at this particular time. Mihai listened with his hands folded in his lap. He asked questions at intervals, precise, specific, the kind of questions that told her he was tracking the evidence carefully, and not simply accepting the narrative. What was the light like on the second morning? Had she had any interaction with the pack, direct or indirect, before the first pup arrived? Was there any possibility the pups had wandered to the door independently? He asked each question without apology, because asking them was his job, and because Elena would have thought less of him if he had not. When she had finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I want to say something I would not say in a seminar room." Elena waited. He said, "I think he chose you. I think this was a decision, and I think it was made specifically about you, not about this location in general. I think the months of observation before the first pup arrived were the assessment period, and I think the assessment reached a conclusion." He paused. "I am aware that this is a significant claim. I am making it as a hypothesis, not a conclusion. But as a hypothesis, it fits the data better than any alternative I can construct." Elena said, "That is approximately where I had arrived." "Good. We will need the cameras to build the evidence base." He looked at the tree line through the window. "Is he likely to come while I am here?" She thought about this. She said, "He did not come in the 4 days after the second pup arrived, which was unusual. I do not know if that was coincidence or if it had something to do with my increased activity in those days. I was making more trips to the village. There was more disruption to the routine." Mihai nodded. "I will try to be as unobtrusive as possible. Which cameras would you have used? if you were positioning them. She showed him where. They went outside in the late afternoon and positioned 4 cameras along the tree line, and Mihai checked each one twice, and then a third time, and showed Elena the coverage angles on his laptop, and they adjusted 2 of them slightly, based on what she knew about where Regula habitually stood. By the time they came back inside, the light was going, and the pups were restless for their evening feeding. Mihai helped with the feeding without being asked, which was one of the things she had always valued about working with him. He did not ask whether he could help with things that clearly needed doing. He held Micah while Elena warmed the formula, and he talked to the pup in the low, steady voice of someone who had handled enough animals to know how to do it correctly, and Micah regarded him with the calm assessment she was beginning to apply to everything. They ate dinner at the table. Elena had made soup the previous day, and talked for 3 hours. They talked about the behavioral literature on pack decision-making, which was richer than the public understanding of it, and which contained a handful of papers suggesting that alpha males in particular situations exhibited what could cautiously be called forward planning. They talked about the specific conditions that might have produced this behavior in this pack in this season. The winter had been hard. Prey populations in the high range had been depleted by 2 successive difficult years. A pack that had produced a large litter in January would be managing significant resource pressure. They talked about the assessment process, and whether there was evidence from other species of large predators deliberately evaluating specific humans over extended periods. There was some. Not much, but some. Mihai had found it in 3 days of literature review before coming here. 2 papers on captive wolf behavior that touched on the edges of what Elena was describing. 1 paper from a bear research program in Sweden that documented something potentially analogous in a different context. Nothing that directly addressed what was happening here. Nothing that was close enough to call a precedent. That is not necessarily a problem, Mihai said. Most documented animal behavior started as an observation that had no precedent. Elena said, I want to be careful. I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. Of course, he said, but I also want you to be careful not to claim less. That is the other error, and in my experience, scientists with your background and your years in the field make the second error more often than the first. We have been trained so thoroughly to avoid overclaiming that we sometimes underclaim things that are real. She thought about this for a long time, after he went to sleep on the narrow spare mattress she had dragged out from the storage space under the bed. She sat at the table in the low light of the lantern and listened to the wind outside and to the pups breathing and to the absolute quiet of the mountain beyond, and she thought about the difference between what the evidence could support and what she knew. She had spent 30 years on the right side of that line. She had built her reputation on the discipline of staying there, but she was sitting alone in a cabin in the Carpathian Mountains, with 3 wolf pups sleeping by her stove, and an old silver wolf, who had been standing at her tree line since November, and the evidence was not the only thing she had. She also had 30 years of knowing what animal behavior felt like from the inside of it, the specific quality of attention and intention that she had learned to recognize the way a musician learns to hear notes in a chord, and what she had been feeling since that first morning in November, and feeling with increasing certainty since the first pup appeared on her doorstep, was that she was being seen, that something old and deliberate and very far from foolish had looked at her and made a decision about what it saw. She could not put that in a paper, not yet, not without the evidence to support it. But she wrote it in the notebook, in the back pages, in the section that was for true things that were not yet ready to be published. She wrote it carefully and completely and without apology. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed, and outside the mountain held the dark and the pines and whatever moved through them, and in the morning, Mihai would begin reviewing the camera footage, and she would begin another day of the work that had, without her planning it, become the most important thing she was doing with her life. Mihai stayed 4 days, and in those 4 days the cameras recorded 22 motion events along the tree line: deer, a fox on 2 occasions, a marten that triggered the northern camera twice in the same night, no wolves. Regulae did not appear while Mihai was present. Mihai did not comment on this directly. Elena did not either. It would have been unscientific to draw conclusions from an absence in a 4-day sample, and they were both aware of it. But on the morning Mihai left, standing on the cabin step with his bags repacked and the cameras still running in the tree line, he looked out at the western edge of the pines for a long moment, before he picked up his bags. He said, "He will come back when I am gone." "Possibly," Elena said. "Not possibly. Mihai said. He will, and the cameras will have him. He picked up his bags. Call me from the village when it happens. I have a colleague at the University of Cluj, Dr. Ada Florescu. She works on cognition and wild canids. I want her to see the footage eventually. Elena said, not yet. When you are ready, he said. He looked at her with the directness of someone who had known her for a long time, and was making a precise observation. You look different from the last time I saw you. At Daniel's reception, you looked like someone standing in the rain who had stopped bothering to look for shelter. Now you look like someone in the rain who is paying attention to what the rain is doing. Elena said, that is a very strange observation. I specialize in strange observations, he said. It is part of why my field papers are better than my theoretical ones. He went down the mountain. Elena went inside and sat with the pups for a while. All three of them now restless and energetic and requiring a kind of management that was more active than it had been a week ago. Mike had begun to test the boundaries of his larger pen in the yard during the daytime hours she gave him outside. Stram navigated his world with increasing confidence, his body's compensation for the malformed leg becoming more fluid and natural by the day. Micah was alert, engaged, and had started a habit of sitting up and examining the door whenever someone came through it, which Elena found both scientifically interesting and personally touching. On the second night after Mihai left, at 2:30 in the morning, she woke to the sound she had been half expecting. Not the sound at the door, a different sound, or rather not a sound at all, but the specific quality of alertness that woke her, the shift in the night's texture that her field-trained nervous system had learned to recognize as the presence of something large in the immediate vicinity. She went to the window first. She looked out. Regale was in the yard. Not at the tree line, in the yard itself, standing 10 feet from the cabin door, his silver coat catching the moonlight so clearly that she could see the movement of his breathing and the angle of his ears and the direction of his gaze. His gaze was on the cabin door. She pulled on her boots and her coat over her sleep clothes and opened the door. They looked at each other. He did not retreat. He did not tense. He stood in the middle of her yard in the moonlight and looked at her with those amber gold eyes, and she stood in the doorway and looked back at him, and then he turned his head deliberately to the right, toward the eastern edge of the yard, toward the woodpile. Elena followed the direction of his gaze. There was a fourth pup beside the woodpile, almost invisible in the shadow, very small, very still. She looked back at Regale. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he lowered his great head in the brief, almost imperceptible movement she had come to understand as the only formal gesture he made, an acknowledgement, a nod that was not quite a nod. Then he turned and walked back to the tree line, and the forest took him back. Elena crossed the yard in her boots on the cold ground and picked up the fourth pup. It was a female, dark gray, nearly black. Her heart, when Elena pressed her palm to the tiny chest, was beating, faint and irregular, but beating. She ran back inside. Later, when Mihai reviewed the camera footage, he would find 17 minutes of Regale moving through the yard, circling the pup, looking at the cabin, looking at the pup, walking to the cabin door and standing before it, then the door opening, and Elena appearing, and the exchange of that long look, and his deliberate turn of the head toward the woodpile. 17 minutes of a wolf in a human yard, doing something that wolves, in the literature that Mihai had spent 30 years studying, did not do. He would call Elena the next morning, after she had called him from the village, and he would say, I have watched it 11 times. I keep watching it because I think I must be misreading it. I am not misreading it. Elena said. No, you are not. He showed you where she was. Yes. He did not carry her to the door because she was too fragile for the distance. That is what I think. There was a silence on the line, the silence of a scientist confronting something his science does not yet have a home for. He said, Ada needs to see this footage. Yes, Elena said. She does, but first let me get the pup through the first week. She walked back up the mountain. Inside the cabin, the fourth pup was breathing, weakly, carefully, with the specific determined fragility of something that has decided, despite everything, to continue. Elena sat beside her and began the work. The fourth pup's name came without deliberation. Elena had resisted naming the others for longer than she had managed with this one. The working name argument had collapsed completely, somewhere around the third week with Mike, when she had caught herself apologizing to him for waking him during a temperature check, and had understood then that the clinical distance she had been trying to maintain was entirely theoretical. With the fourth pup, the name arrived, before she had even carried her back inside from the woodpile. It arrived in the moment of lifting, in the specific weight of the small cold body against her palms, like a word remembered rather than invented. Nina. She had had a sister named Nina once. A sister who had died before either of them was old enough to form the kinds of memories that last. Elena was 4 when it happened, and what she retained was not really a memory so much as an impression. Warmth. The smell of something sweet. A sound she associated with the other crib. The loss had happened before she was old enough to grieve it in any way she recognized as grief, but the name had stayed. She had always carried it somewhere in herself, carefully, without weight, as people carry the names of the ones they lost too early to really lose. Nina, then. The fourth pup situation was the worst of any of the 4. This was clear within the first 30 minutes of having her inside, once Elena had her near the stove and could assess her properly. The heart rate was fast and irregular, in a way that the other 3 had not presented. The temperature was lower than any of the others had been on arrival. Her skin response when Elena gently pinched the scruff was slow. The tissue did not spring back the way hydrated tissue should. She had been compromised for longer than the others before delivery. Whatever had brought Regale to the decision to place her at the woodpile rather than the door, the assessment that carrying her the full distance was too great a risk, had been correct. Elena worked through the night without stopping. The electrolyte solution in tiny increments. The temperature management in stages, slower and more cautious than with the others, because this body was further from equilibrium and needed the rewarming to happen gradually. The monitoring every few minutes, the hand pressed to the tiny chest to count the beats and assess their quality. The low voice, always the low voice, not because it accomplished anything physiological, but because it was the thing she could give completely and continuously, the single resource she had in unlimited supply. At some point around 3 in the morning she became aware that Mike was awake in his pen in the yard and was making the sound he made when he was uneasy, a low, soft repetition that was not quite a howl and not quite a whimper. She went out briefly and spoke to him, and he settled, and she came back in and looked at Nina. She thought, the pack knows she is here. She thought, they can hear this. She did not know if that was true in any meaningful way. She did not know whether the faint sounds of a compromised pup could carry to the ridge, but she thought about Regale, standing at the tree line in the cameras, night after night, watching the cabin. She thought about what it meant to keep watch over something you had placed in someone else's hands. She thought about what it required of a creature to give something over and then wait. She thought about what she knew about that kind of waiting. She did not cry. She was not at the point where crying was available to her in the middle of a medical situation that required everything she had. But she noted the thought in the back of her mind and kept working, and the hours passed, and at the first gray of dawn, Nina's breathing had deepened, and the heart rate had come down from its alarming peak to something merely concerning, and Elena sat back on her heels and allowed herself, for the first time in hours, to breathe without counting the pup's breaths alongside her own. She called Mihai from the village later that morning, after going down to use the phone at Petra's shop. She told him what had happened, the sound at the door, the yard, Regale's deliberate direction of her gaze, the pup by the woodpile. She told him about Nina's condition on arrival, and what she had done through the night, and where they were now. Mihai listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was genuinely alarmed by what she was describing. He said, "I am coming this weekend." She said, "Good, bring the specialist formula. And anything you have for cardiac support in neonates." He arrived Saturday afternoon with the formula and the cardiac supplement, and 2 kilograms of various other things he had assembled, with the help of a veterinary pharmacologist at the university, who had not asked too many questions about the species involved. He also brought Ada's phone number, written on a folded piece of paper that he gave to Elena along with the supplies. "She has seen the footage," he said. "I sent her the first clips. She called me the same day." Elena took the number and put it in her pocket. Ada Florescu was 44 years old, compact and precise and unhurried in her speech, and she arrived on a Tuesday 3 weeks later, after Elena finally called her and said she was ready. She reviewed the full camera footage that first evening, without speaking for long stretches, and ask Elena 3 hours of questions over 2 evenings. Questions so specific and well-constructed that Elena found herself reassessing her own account in the process of answering them, finding details she had not thought to include, recognizing assumptions she had built into her descriptions without naming them as assumptions. On the morning after her second night at the cabin, Ada said, "What I am about to tell you is my honest professional assessment and not a compliment." Elena said, "Good, tell me." Ada said, "What you have documented here is unlike anything in the current literature on wild wolf behavior. The closest analogues are in captivity, and even those are partial. The sustained observation period, the selectivity of the deliveries, the modification of delivery method based on pup condition on the night of the 4th, the consistent monitoring afterwards." She paused. "If you can build this into a publishable evidentiary standard, it will be significant. Not interesting significant. Significant, significant." Elena said, "We will need more time." Ada said, "Yes, and more camera coverage. And I would like to bring a colleague from the comparative cognition department if you are willing." Elena thought about this. She looked at Nina, who was now 10 days old in the cabin, and who had, improbably and with great effort, and apparent personal stubbornness, fought her way to something that could be called stable, and was beginning to look like something that might eventually be called healthy. She said, "Let me get through the next month, then yes." She was not ready to let the mountain be crowded with people yet. She was not ready to have this turned into a project before she understood what it was. This was not obstruction. This was a scientist's instinct for the right pace of a thing, the sense that some kinds of observation require a particular stillness in the observer, and that the stillness was hers to protect. She went back to the work, the 4 pups, the notebook, the evening check of the cameras. The tree line at night, where Regale appeared, with the reliable frequency of someone keeping a promise. She wrote in her notebook one evening, "I have been afraid, since coming here, that I did not have enough left in me to do anything useful with what remained of my life. I think that was the wrong fear. I think the correct question was not whether I had enough left, but whether I was willing to give what I had to what was in front of me. The answer, it turns out, is yes." She closed the notebook. Outside, from the ridge, the pack began to howl. All of them. The full chorus, every voice, overlapping and weaving in the dark above the cabin. Nina, in her box, turned her small head toward the sound. She did not make a sound herself. She was still too young, still too new in the world for that. But she turned her head, and her ears moved toward the voices, and something in her face changed in a way that Elena had no scientific category for, and did not try to create one. It was simply recognition. From this distance, across the gap of species and circumstance, and the extraordinary chain of events that had brought her to this box beside this stove, it was simply a small creature, recognizing the sound of where she came from. Elena listened with her. The howling went on for a long time. Nina fought for the first 10 days with a singleness of purpose that Elena had rarely observed in an animal this young and this small. She had been in bad shape on arrival. Worse than the others. Worse than Elena had let herself fully register in those first hours when she was focused on doing the work and not on assessing the odds. But she ate when food was offered, with the uncoordinated aggression of something that has decided food is a priority. She slept the deep sleep of a body rebuilding itself. She woke alert, and the alertness increased day by day, in a way that Elena tracked in her notes with the satisfaction of someone watching a graph move in the right direction. On the 4th day, the heart rate stabilized. On the 7th day, she gained weight for the first time in a measurable way. On the 10th day, she stood up in her box on her own and looked around at the cabin with the expression of someone encountering a new situation and deciding, on balance, that it is acceptable. Mihai had been there for the first week and watched most of this happen. He watched it with the notebook open in his lap and the pen busy, but he also watched it the other way, the way Elena had been watching things since she arrived on this mountain, with the eyes rather than the pen, with the part of perception that does not translate neatly into language, but that registers truth anyway. He said on the 5th morning, before they had talked about anything professional, "She is going to make it." Elena said, "Yes, I think she is." He said, "Good," and opened his notebook, and they talked about the camera positioning and the footage from the previous night, which showed Regale at the western tree line for 8 minutes at 11:43. standing with his usual stillness and his gaze on the cabin, and they talked about what they were observing and how to build it into something that would stand up to professional scrutiny, and what Ada had said, and what the comparative cognition colleague might add. And the conversation was good, the way a scientific conversation between two people who respect each other and are genuinely engaged by the same problem is always good, productive and specific, and full of the right kind of disagreement, the kind that clarifies rather than obstructs. But running alongside it, in Elena, was the other awareness. The awareness that was not scientific, the awareness of what it meant that an old wolf had crossed her yard in the middle of the night and pointed with his gaze at a pup he could not carry all the way to her door, and had trusted her to understand what he was pointing at, and had been right. She had been thinking about that trust for 10 days. She thought about it while she fed Nina in the mornings, and checked her temperature, and sat with her in the evenings while the fire burned low. She thought about what it required, not in the wolf, whose requirements were beyond her ability to know with certainty, but in herself, what it required of her to be the person that an old wolf had, after months of careful observation, decided was a viable recipient of his most fragile and most difficult burdens. She thought she had underestimated herself. She had come to this mountain convinced that she was emptied out, convinced that the grief and the loss and the divorce and the 14 months of trying to recover on a schedule had used up whatever she had been made of. She had come here to rest the exhausted machinery of herself without requiring it to produce anything. And what she had found was that the machinery was not exhausted. It was grieving, which is different. The difference matters enormously. Exhausted machinery has nothing left. A grieving person still has everything they ever had, the same skill, the same intelligence, the same capacity for attention and care, and the specific kind of love that expresses itself as rigorous, sustained, unglamorous work. They simply cannot access it through the grief, while the grief is at full height. But the grief had moved. It had not gone. It would not go. She was not naive enough to expect it to go, but it had shifted enough that she could stand beside it rather than inside it, and standing beside it, she could see what was still there. What was still there was considerable. She thought about Daniel, who had known this about her before she did, who had said it to her more than once in the gentlest possible terms, who had believed in her competence and her capacity with the uncritical devotion of a child who grew up watching his parent be very good at something, and who did not yet understand that adults lose faith in themselves. He had not lost faith. He had simply believed in her, right up to the end, in the way that only certain people believe in you, not because the evidence compelled them, but because they had chosen to. She thought about choosing. The evening of the 10th day, after Mihai had gone back to Bucharest, and Ada had not yet arrived, and the cabin was quiet with just herself and the 4 pups, she sat at the table, after they were all settled, and she wrote a long entry in her notebook, not field observations, not the scientific record, the other one, the one she was beginning to think of as the real one, the one that was going to become something eventually, though she could not yet see its final shape. She wrote about coming to the mountain. She wrote about the 6 weeks before the first pup when she had been trying to stop, to put herself down like a bag that had become too heavy, and about the way the stopping had not quite happened because her body would not cooperate with it, her eyes would not stop noticing, her hands would not stop wanting to be useful. She wrote, "I do not think I came here to disappear. I think I came here because I needed to be in a place that was so fundamentally itself that I could remember how to be fundamentally myself. The mountain does not perform its mountains. It simply is the mountain, without apology, without effort, without any interest in whether you find it beautiful or cold or both. And something in me needed that example." She put down her pen. She looked at the 4 pups sleeping near the stove, arranged in their boxes, in the specific geometric relationship they had settled into over the weeks. Mike and Stram with their noses close, Micah at a slight angle, Nana, in her own box still, slightly apart, still rebuilding. She said, "We are going to figure out what comes next." None of them woke up, but Mike's ear swiveled toward the sound of her voice, and that was enough. Dr. Ada Florescu arrived on a Tuesday in late April, and within 3 hours of her arrival, Elena understood that Mihai had been right to press for her involvement, and that she herself had been right to wait until she was ready. Both things were true. They were not contradictory. The readiness and the necessity had existed simultaneously, and the timing was now correct in a way it had not been 2 weeks earlier. And Ada knew, from the moment she came through the door and saw the 4 pups and the notebooks on the table and the camera footage waiting on the laptop, that she had come at the right moment, and not a moment too soon. Ada was compact and precise, and carried a quality of stillness that Elena recognized as a professional characteristic developed by years of field observation, the specific physical stillness of someone who has trained themselves not to disturb what they are watching. She sat in the cabin chair that first afternoon, with her hands quiet in her lap, and watched the pups move around the pen Elena had constructed from 2 boxes and a length of mesh fencing, and she did not speak for nearly an hour. Then she asked her first question. The questions went on for 3 hours that first day, and resumed at breakfast the following morning. They were the best questions Elena had received in years of peer review and collaboration, precise, targeted, aimed at exactly the points where the evidence was strongest, and the points where it was thinnest, exposing the architecture of Elena's observations in a way that allowed both of them to see where it held firmly, and where it needed more support. The footage held firmly. The 17 minutes of regale in the yard on the night of the 4th pup, that held. The 31 documented appearances at the tree line, that held. The selectivity of the deliveries, each pup with a specific condition that made it a net resource cost to the pack, that held. What needed more support was the mechanism, the internal process, the why. Ada said, on the second morning at breakfast, I want to propose a framework, and I want you to tell me where it is wrong. Elena said, go ahead. Ada said, what you are describing is consistent with a class of behavior I have been developing a theoretical account of for the past 4 years, which I have called ecological redistribution in social carnivores. The basic idea is this. Under sufficient environmental and social pressure, highly experienced alpha individuals in certain species appear to expand their resource management strategies beyond the boundaries of the pack's own social network. They identify entities in the surrounding environment that they assess as capable of sustaining what the pack cannot sustain. In captive settings, there are 3 documented cases of something like this, all involving alpha pairs and human caretakers. In the wild, there is nothing comparable in the literature, not because the behavior does not occur, but because the conditions for it are rare, and the observation of it in the wild is extremely difficult. Elena said, and you think regale fits this framework? I think regale fits this framework better than any animal I have encountered, directly or in the literature, and I think the element that takes it beyond the captive precedence is the specificity of his selection. He did not bring the pups to the village. He did not bring them to the hunting territory to the north, where there are other human structures. He brought them to you, specifically, after a period of observation that you estimate at roughly 5 months. Elena said, that is the part I can describe but cannot fully explain. Ada said, that is the part that I think is most important. They looked at each other across the breakfast table, with the 4 pups moving in their pen, and the camera footage running on the laptop, and the spring morning coming through the window in flat gray light. Ada said, I have been doing this work for 20 years. In 20 years, I have not encountered anything that I would characterize as a wolf making an extended, specific, individual assessment of a particular human being, and then taking action based on that assessment, not in captive settings, not in the documented literature. What you have described, if it holds up to the standard of evidence we will need to publish it, is genuinely without precedent. She said it the way a person of great professional caution says something that is genuinely extraordinary, carefully, precisely, with awareness of the weight of the claim, and the willingness to carry it anyway because the evidence demands it. Elena said, we need more time and more camera coverage, and we need to document the monitoring behavior more systematically. Yes, Ada said, all of that, and I want to run the footage by a colleague in comparative cognition at Cluj. His name is Dr. Stefan Varga. He worked on problem solving in captive wolves for 8 years, and he is the most careful analyst I know. Elena said, let me think about that. She was not obstructing. She was pacing. There was a difference. The right pace for this work was the pace of the mountain, and the wolves and the season, not the pace of academic urgency, and she was going to protect that pace for as long as she needed to. Over the following weeks, the work expanded and deepened. Ada returned twice more in May. Mihai came on alternate weekends. The camera network grew. 2 additional cameras that Ada funded from her research budget, positioned to capture angles that the original 4 had missed. The data accumulated in a way that was clean and systematic and increasingly hard to argue with. And Regale kept coming. 31 appearances in the first 5 weeks of camera coverage, then 3 more in May, then a gap of 12 days that worried Elena more than she was willing to admit to Mihai on the phone, and then his return on a Monday night, clear on the Western camera, standing for 9 minutes and then going. She had started noting, in a separate section of her notebook, the quality of his appearances, not just the fact of them but the character, how long he stood, where his gaze went, whether there were other pack members visible in the footage behind him. She had begun to read his visits the way she read a long piece of text, looking not just at the individual data points, but at the overall pattern, the shape of the thing across time. What she read was this: he was not losing interest. Whatever had brought him to those 31 appearances was not diminishing. It was consistent in a way that pure behavioral momentum does not account for, in a way that simple habit would not produce. Habits attenuate. They fade at the edges. What she was seeing did not fade. Each appearance had the same quality of purposefulness as the first ones, the same stillness, the same directed attention toward the cabin. She told this to Ada on the phone one evening. Ada said, "I know. I have been thinking about the same thing. And I want to say something that I am going to put in softer language in any paper we write, but that I want to say plainly to you, because I think you can handle plain language." "Go ahead," Elena said. "I think he is not checking on the pups. I think the pups were a reason to establish the relationship, but the relationship has become independent of the pups. I think he is coming back because of you." There was a silence on the line. Elena said, "I have thought that too." Ada said, "I know. I have been waiting for you to say it." Elena looked at the notebook in her hand. She looked at the tree line through the window. The night was clear, and the moon was up, and the western edge of the pines was silver and empty, but she had stopped being surprised when it was empty. The emptiness was just the absence of the appearance, not the absence of the presence. She said, "How do we write that?" Ada said, very carefully, and with a great deal of supporting evidence, that we do not yet fully have. A pause. But we will have it. That is what the cameras are for, and that is what time is for. Elena said, "Yes." She said goodnight and set down the phone, and sat at the table with her notebook, and wrote for a long time in the clear spring dark. And outside the mountain was exactly itself, and the wolves were somewhere on the ridge, and the 4 pups were sleeping in the cabin behind her, and the work continued. The summer moved slowly, and was full of work. The 4 pups grew in the accelerated, impressive way of wolf pups once they are past the fragile early weeks, and into the developmental phase where everything is about size and strength and learning the world. Mike became large enough, by June, that Elena had to expand his outdoor pen twice, and by July he was the size of a young adult, and moving with the ease of an animal that has finally settled into its body's real proportions. Stram's leg was the subject of a careful ongoing assessment. Dr. Bogdan, the wildlife veterinarian Mihai had arranged to visit from Cluj, came in June, and spent 2 days examining him, watching him move, measuring his gait parameters, assessing the muscle development on both sides of the malformed joint. His report was cautious and honest. The malformation was permanent and would not improve. The compensation was real and was improving. Stram had developed a distinctive rolling adjustment of his left shoulder that redistributed his weight during movement, and the muscles supporting that adjustment were strong and well developed for a pup his age. Whether the compensation would be sufficient for the demands of wild pack life depended on factors that would only become clear when he was older, and when he could be observed in a natural setting. Elena read the report and wrote her own notes alongside it. She had watched Stram every day for 4 months, and she had an assessment of her own that she did not put in the formal notes, because it was not the kind of thing that belonged in formal notes. She thought he was going to be all right. She thought the stubbornness he had shown from his first morning in the cabin, the loudness and the energy, and the refusal to accept that the box was the boundary of his world, that stubbornness was not going to leave him. It was not a scientific assessment, but it was what she thought. Micah had recovered so completely from the respiratory infection that by early summer there was no residual sign of it at all. She was bright and fast, and had developed a habit of watching things for longer than the others did before engaging with them. A watchfulness that reminded Elena of the best field researchers, the ones who understood that sustained observation produced knowledge that quick interaction could not. And Nina continued to do what she had been doing since the first days, fighting, steadily and without drama, to be more and more present in the world. Her dark coat had developed silver tipping at the ends by July, giving her a two-toned quality that was striking and individual. She was still smaller than the others. She would always be slightly smaller, Elena suspected, the body bearing the record of the difficult start. But she was healthy, genuinely, measurably, completely healthy by any metric Elena could apply, and applying them carefully and often had become one of the small satisfactions of her days. The research work deepened through the summer. Ada's colleague Dr. Varga came in June, a quiet, methodical man who spent 3 days reviewing footage and asking questions, and then went away and sent a 12-page written response that Ada forwarded to Elena with the note, "He thinks this is extraordinary." Those are his words. He does not use that word. They had, between them, accumulated a substantial body of evidence by midsummer. The camera footage alone was 47 hours of documented activity, of which a significant portion captured regularly at the tree line. Ada had developed a statistical analysis of the appearances that demonstrated their non-random character, with a confidence level that would satisfy the reviewers at the journals she had in mind. Mihai had built the behavioral analysis of the pup deliveries, comparing each pup's condition on arrival with the documented conditions of pups that packs typically cannot sustain, and demonstrating the correlation with a precision that he was proud of, and that Elena thought deserved the pride. There was one piece of footage that they returned to more than any other. It was from a night in mid-May, from the camera on the western tree line. Regale was at his usual spot, standing and looking at the cabin, as he had on 30 other occasions. He had been there for 11 minutes. Then he turned his head to the right, looking along the forest edge, and held that position for 43 seconds. Then he turned back to the cabin. On the simultaneous footage from the northern camera, a deer was visible moving along the forest edge in the area Regale had been looking toward. He had seen the deer. He had looked at it. He had looked back at the cabin. He had stayed. Elena had watched this sequence more than 20 times. Each time she watched it, she felt the same thing. Not excitement, which was too shallow a word for it, but a specific kind of awe that she had felt only a handful of times in 30 years of field work. The awe of witnessing something true about the nature of another creature, something that revealed the interior of an experience she could not share but could, for a moment, understand. He had chosen to stay. In the face of the pull that was most fundamental to what he was, the hunter's pull toward prey, the body's pull toward the nourishment that sustained the pack, he had chosen to stay. He had looked at the cabin, and he had stayed. She wrote about this in her notebook, in the back pages, in the section that was not for scientific observations but that was, she had come to understand, the most important section. She wrote, "There is a kind of faithfulness that exceeds what we usually mean by the word. It is the kind that holds in the face of competing instincts, that chooses one thing over other things that are also real needs. I have been thinking about what that kind of faithfulness requires of the one who practices it. I think it requires a certainty about what matters that is stronger than the moment-to-moment pull of urgency. I think it requires knowing, with the whole body, what is worth staying for." She read this back. She thought it was about the wolf. She thought it was also about other things. She left it in the notebook and closed the cover and went to feed the pups their evening meal, and the summer evening was warm and long and full of light, and on the ridge above the cabin, the pack moved through the pines in the last light, and the mountain continued to be entirely itself, which was the thing it had been teaching her all along. The decision about what came next for each of the 4 pups was not a single decision made on a single day. It was a series of smaller decisions, each one following from the evidence that had accumulated to that point. Each one made in the deliberate way that Elena made all professional decisions, with everything she knew, applied to the specific situation in front of her, without wishful thinking in either direction. Mike's direction had been clear since early summer. He was healthy, large, behaviorally appropriate for a young wolf male of his age, and increasingly frustrated by the boundaries of the cabin and pen environment in a way that was not a behavior problem, but a natural pressure, the push of an animal that is ready for the world it belongs in. His frustration was not destructive. It was not aggressive. It was simply the consistent, patient, increasingly insistent expression of something that knew what it was, and was not yet being allowed to be it fully. Elena documented this in her notes with the same precision she applied to everything, and felt, alongside the precision, a complicated mix of satisfaction and anticipatory loss that she did not put in the notes because it was hers rather than the data's. Mika was similarly clear. Her health was excellent, her development was strong, and she had shown, in the observational sessions Elena conducted in the extended outdoor pen through the summer, the behavioral profile that field researchers used as indicators of wild readiness, the correct social responses, the appropriate hunting orientation, the spatial awareness and movement patterns of a wolf that has been properly developing toward the kind of life it was built for. Stram remained the most complex assessment. Dr. Bogdan made a second visit in August and produced a revised report that was slightly more optimistic than the June one, not by much, but measurably. The compensation for the malformed leg had continued to develop. The rolling adjustment of his left shoulder had become so natural and so integrated into his movement that a person who did not know about the leg would not, watching him at speed from a distance, immediately identify it as an irregularity. Whether that was sufficient for the specific demands of pack life in the high range, the pursuit of prey over difficult terrain in winter conditions, the physical competition for social standing, remained genuinely uncertain. Dr. Bogdan recommended inclusion in the soft-release enclosure, with careful observation of how the pack responded to him. The final decision about full return to the wild would be made on the basis of what that observation revealed. Elena agreed with this recommendation and added it to her own notes in her own terms. Stram goes to the enclosure. The pack will tell us what we need to know. Nina was the clearest of all, though the clarity was the most difficult kind. The clarity that tells you something you did not want to know, but that is undeniable once you have looked at the evidence honestly. Nina had bonded with human presence from the beginning, from the earliest days in the cabin when she was still fragile, and the human voice, and the human warmth, and the human presence were the scaffolding within which she was building herself. This was not a failure. It was the natural consequence of her situation on arrival, so compromised, so deeply in need of intensive human support for so long, that the human relationship had become structurally central to her sense of safety and self, in a way that the others, who had arrived in better condition, and had had more physiological resources to draw on even in the cabin, had not experienced in the same way. In a trial period in the outdoor enclosure in August, Nina had been calm but unengaged with the forest. She had not shown the specific alertness and orientation, the nose work, the movement patterns, the attention to the smells coming from the tree line, that Mike and Micah and even Stram had shown from their first hours in the enclosure. She had spent most of the trial period oriented toward the cabin. When Elena came to check on her, Nina had come immediately to the fence. She had pressed her nose against the wire, and she had stayed there for as long as Elena was visible. Elena had stood at the fence for a long time, her hand on the wire on the other side of Nina's nose. She had thought about what the evidence required of her. She had applied everything she knew about wolf development and imprinting, and the specific conditions that produce certain outcomes. She had been, in that moment, as honest as she had ever been in her professional life. She filed the care permit application the following week. The process took 6 weeks and required 3 visits from a wildlife authority inspector, and a management plan, and an annual review commitment, and a veterinary oversight arrangement. Elena completed each requirement with the thoroughness she applied to everything. The permit was granted in mid-October. Nina, then, was staying. The knowledge settled into the cabin, and the routine, and the daily texture of things, with a naturalness that surprised Elena. She had expected it to feel like a decision with weight to it. It felt, instead, like something that had already been decided, and was simply now being acknowledged. Nina was already as much a part of the cabin, and the mountain, and the particular life that had developed here, as the stove, and the woodpile, and the shelf of the dead man's books. The permit was paperwork in service of an existing reality. The preparation for the enclosure began in August. Mihai coordinated the construction, a large fenced area, approximately 2 acres, at the eastern edge of the forest above the cabin, where the pines met the open ground, in a configuration that meant the smell and sound of the pack's territory would be present from inside the enclosure, without requiring any approach from the pack. 2 forestry workers and a young wildlife volunteer named Radu, who had driven from Bucharest specifically because he had read Elena's correspondence with Mihai and wanted to be involved, built the enclosure over 3 weeks. Radu was 26 and had the specific combination of technical competence and genuine enthusiasm that made him immediately useful. He worked hard and asked good questions, and spent his evenings sitting with the pups in the outdoor pen, with the expression of someone for whom the world had just become larger. Elena noticed this, and found it, alongside everything else, genuinely heartening. The capacity to be expanded by what you encounter. She had thought she might have lost that. She was watching it operate in someone else, and recognizing it, and the recognition told her it was still in her too. The enclosure was completed in early September. Elena spent 2 weeks working with all 3 of the reintroduction candidates, Mike, Micah, Stramb, in the new space before the pack was engaged. This was the soft phase of the soft release, familiarization with the space, with the sounds and smells that reached it from the forest, with the increased sensory complexity of being in a place where the wild was immediately present, rather than behind a mountain's worth of distance. She watched them adapt. She documented everything. She felt, alongside the documentation, the specific satisfaction of watching something go correctly, not perfectly, not without complication, but in the direction it was meant to go. Mike's alertness in the enclosure, Micah's systematic exploration of the perimeter, Stramb's careful navigation of the terrain with his rolling gait, and the way his body met the uneven ground with an adaptiveness that was, in its own way, beautiful to watch. She called it beautiful in her notebook. In the back pages, in the section for true things. On a clear September morning, the morning she had decided they were ready for the next phase, she stood outside the enclosure before dawn and listened to the mountain. The pack was on the ridge above, as they had been all summer. She could hear them moving through the trees, the occasional low sound that carried down on the still air. She said, to the dark and the pines and whatever on the ridge was paying attention, "We are getting ready." Then she went inside and made tea, and waited for the day to begin. The enclosure phase began in the 2nd week of September. Elena and Radu transferred Mike, Mika, and Stram to the enclosure on a Tuesday morning, using the transport crates she had borrowed from the Wildlife Authority and handling each wolf herself, because they trusted her hands more than any other hands, and trust, in this kind of transition, was a practical advantage, and not a sentimental one. All 3 went into the enclosure without significant distress. Mike came out of his crate first, and put his nose immediately to the ground, reading the new space, the new smells, the new textures of air that came from the tree line. Within 30 seconds his head came up sharply, his body oriented toward the forest above the enclosure. He could smell the pack. They were up there somewhere, not close enough to be visible or audible, but present, in the way that matters most to wolves, which is through the chemical record of their passage in the air and on the ground. Mike stood still for a long time. Elena stood at the fence and watched him stand still, and felt the gravity of the moment without trying to describe it in any language. Micah emerged from her crate and moved immediately to Mike's side. They stood together, reading the air, their bodies angled toward the same direction. Stram came out last and moved to their left, creating the 3-point formation that she had come to associate with them in moments of assessment, a geometry that seemed to be their natural configuration when they were encountering something together. Radu, beside Elena at the fence, said very quietly, "Are they talking to each other?" Elena said, "Not in the way we talk, but yes." Over the following days, the pack approached the enclosure gradually, exactly as she had hoped and as the protocol had specified. The sub-adults came first, 2 young wolves who appeared at the tree line above the enclosure on the 2nd morning, and stood there for an hour, their noses working, before retreating. They returned that afternoon, came closer, returned the next morning, closer still. The body language told her what the cameras confirmed. There was recognition happening. These wolves knew the smell of the 3 in the enclosure. They had known it since the den, since before the pups had developed enough to be compromised, since the time when all of them had been part of the same world. The months of separation had not erased that knowledge. It had complicated it, added the human smell and the cabin smell, and all the other smells of the life in the enclosure, but the original recognition was still there beneath those additions. On the 4th day, Regula came. He came alone, in the early morning. He came to the fence, and stood there with the quality of stillness she had spent a year learning to read, and he looked at the 3 wolves in the enclosure, one by one, in turn, with the same directed attention he brought to looking at the cabin. Elena watched from a distance, through binoculars. Mike approached the fence slowly, with the caution of a young wolf meeting an older and more dominant one through a barrier. He stopped 2 feet from the wire. Regula did not move. They were 3 feet apart. Elena could see the quality of the attention on both sides of the fence. Mike's alertness, his slight drop in posture, the beginning of the signals of appropriate deference. Regalé's complete stillness, and then one thing that was not stillness. A low sound, she was too far away to hear, but could see in the movement of his throat. And then, in response, the way Mike's ears came forward, and then angled back slightly. Then Regalé's tail moved. One time. A brief controlled sweep. Mihai, who had arrived the day before specifically for this, was watching through his own binoculars beside her. He said, without lowering them. He acknowledged him. Elena said, "Yes." "That is not a greeting you give a stranger." "No," she said, "it is not." Regaló stayed at the fence for 20 minutes. He looked at Mika, who approached with less caution than Meek, and received a similar, slightly briefer acknowledgement. He looked at Stramb, who came last, and who navigated the uneven ground near the fence with his rolling gait, and Regalé looked at the gate, and then looked at Stramb's face, with the specific quality of attention that Elena had spent a year learning to distinguish from casual looking. It was the look of assessment. It was the look of someone deciding something. She held her breath. Regalé's tail moved again. The same brief, controlled sweep. Then he turned and walked back into the forest. Elena lowered the binoculars. Her hands were not shaking. She had expected them to be. Mihai said, "He is accepting them." She said, "Yes." He said, "All three." She said, "Yes." Cool. They stood for a long time at the edge of the enclosure and did not say anything further, because there was nothing further that needed to be said about that particular moment. It was its own thing, complete in itself, and the best response to it was to let it be what it was. Inside the enclosure, the three wolves were standing at the fence looking at the place where Regalé had stood. They stayed there for a long time after he had gone. The 2 weeks that followed were the most carefully documented of the entire year. Mihai stayed for 10 of them. Ada came for 5. Dr. Bogdan visited twice. The Wildlife Authority sent an observer who sat at the edge of the enclosure with a clipboard and wrote things down and said very little, and Elena respected him for the saying very little, because it was the right response to what they were all watching. The pack visited the enclosure 12 times in those 2 weeks. The subadults grew bolder with each visit, spending longer at the tree line, eventually coming to within 20 meters of the fence on the 7th visit. On the 9th visit, 2 of them came all the way to the fence and pressed their noses against the wire at the spots where Meek and Mika were standing on the other side. Elena photographed this from a distance and made notes and tried to stay scientific about it, and mostly succeeded. On the 12th visit, on a cold, clear morning in early October, Regalé returned. He came with 2 subadults this time, the same 2 who had pressed their noses against the wire 3 days earlier. He stood at the fence again and looked at the 3 wolves in the enclosure again, and this time, the exchange between him and Mike lasted for several minutes and involved an extended period of parallel movement along the fence on both sides that Elena had never seen documented in any interpack contact scenario in the literature, and that she was going to need a very careful set of words to describe. Dr. Bogdan, watching beside her, said, "That is an integration display." Elena said, "I know. He is telling the subadults that these wolves are part of the group." She said, "Yes." He said, "I have worked with wolves in rehabilitation and reintroduction contexts for 14 years, and I have never witnessed an alpha male do that through a fence. With wolves, he has not had direct contact with since they were newborns." Elena did not respond. She was watching Stram, who was moving along the fence on his side, while Regalé moved on the other, matching his pace, his rolling gait making its characteristic adjustment at each change of terrain. Regalé looked at the gate. He had looked at it each time. He looked at it now, and then he looked at Stram's face, and Stram looked back at him. And there was something in that mutual looking that Elena was not going to be able to describe in any language adequate to it, but that she was going to keep trying to describe anyway, for as long as it took to find the words. 2 days later, Dr. Bogdan issued his final assessment. Mike and Micah, ready for full release. Stram, he was quiet for a long time, and then he said the same thing. Elena read the assessment and sat with it for an evening. Then she called Mihai and told him the date she had decided on. Mihai said, "How are you?" She said, "I am ready." He said, "That is not the same question." She said, "I know, but it is the answer I have." He accepted this because he knew her, and because it was true, and the date was set, and the mountain continued to hold everything in it, with the complete indifference that had become, over the course of this year, one of the things she loved best about it. The morning of the release was a Wednesday in late October. Elena had been awake since before 4. Not with anxiety exactly. She had moved past anxiety some weeks ago, had passed through it, and come out the other side into something calmer and more specific. What she felt in the darkness before the release morning was not fear of the outcome, but alertness to it, the sharpened attention of someone who understands that something significant is about to happen and is determined to be fully present for every part of it. She made tea. She went and checked on Nina, who was in her outdoor pen, and who looked up at Elena's footsteps with her dark amber eyes, and made the low sound she made in the mornings. Not a greeting exactly, but an acknowledgement, the wolf's equivalent of a nod. Elena checked the water and the condition of the pen and spoke to Nina for a few minutes, and Nina listened with the composed attention she brought to everything, and then turned back to whatever she had been doing before Elena came. She made tea and sat at the table and looked at Daniel's photograph in the early dark. The boy with the frog. She had stopped needing to say anything to it, she had realized some weeks ago. For months she had felt the need to narrate things to the photograph, to bring Daniel into the events of her days because he was not present to be brought in any other way. But the narration had become, at some point she could not identify precisely, less necessary. Not because she had stopped thinking about him, she would never stop thinking about him, and she had stopped wanting to stop, which was itself something, but because the relationship had found a different form. He was in what she did now. He was in the notebooks and the careful attention, and the willingness to be surprised. He was in the pups she had kept alive. He was not absent. He had simply become part of the texture of the work. She told the photograph, one more time, about the day. Then she went outside. The people arrived by 8. Mihai was already there, having come the previous afternoon. Ada was on video from Bucharest, on a laptop propped on the top fence post of the enclosure. Dr. Bogdan arrived at 8:15, precise as always. Radu was there, standing at the south corner of the enclosure in the cold morning, with his hands in his pockets and an expression that Elena recognized as the expression of someone trying to be professional and largely succeeding. 2 observers from the wildlife authorities stood at a respectful distance with clipboards. And Nina was in a temporary pen beside the enclosure, watching everything through the wire, with those large dark eyes. The 3 crates were positioned inside the enclosure. Elena handled the wolves herself. This was not sentiment. It was practical. Mike, Micah, and Stram had been through many significant transitions in their lives, and in all of them, the constant had been Elena's hands and Elena's voice. Using that constant in this transition was not a favor to herself. It was a favor to them. Mike went into his crate with a minimum of drama, which was characteristic of him. He had always been the one who met new situations with curiosity rather than resistance. His posture in the crate was alert but not agitated, his nose working at the slats, reading the morning. Micah went in with the focused attention she brought to everything, a calmness that was not passivity, but the specific, active calmness of a creature that is paying full attention and has decided, on the basis of that attention, that the situation is manageable. Stram required a second moment of persuasion, which was also characteristic. He had strong opinions about transitions and was not afraid to express them. But he went in, and he settled, and Elena latched the crate door with a precision she applied to everything. She stood outside the crates for a moment, before she opened the first one. The morning was cold and very clear, the sky above the pines a flat, deep blue that had the quality of early winter light. The forest above the enclosure was still. She could not hear the pack. She had not expected to, not yet, not at this hour. They would be further up the ridge, moving through the morning, in whatever pattern the morning required of them. She opened Mike's crate. He came out with the deliberateness she had come to associate with him in important moments, not rushing, but fully committed once he moved. He put his nose to the ground. He turned in a slow circle. Then his head came up, and his whole body changed. He had caught the scent of the pack, not the enclosure-mediated version, not the distant trace that had been reaching them for weeks, the direct, clear, close scent of his pack in the forest above him. They were not far. Elena realized this before the wildlife observer beside Mihai said it quietly, and with the note of someone confirming something they had thought they were imagining. They are close. Mika came out of her crate and went immediately to Mick's side. They stood together in the cold morning, reading the air, their bodies perfectly still except for their noses, which were working with a speed and complexity of movement that she had only ever seen in wolves when the scent input was very large and very significant. Stram came out last with his rolling gait and moved to their left, and the three of them stood in their triangle formation facing the tree line, and Elena stood at the fence and watched them and let herself feel, completely, what this moment was. From the ridge, not close, but close enough, the pack began to howl. It was the full pack, not a fragment of it, not the nearby sub-adults, but all of them, the entire social structure of 15 years' worth of this territory, voices layering and responding and rising, and the three wolves at the fence turned their faces upward to it simultaneously. The wildlife observer beside Mihai said, in a voice stripped completely of professional composure, "I have done this for 14 years. I have never heard the pack howl during a release." The howling went on. It changed in texture as it went on. New voices joining, some voices dropping away and returning, the sound rising and falling and rising again. Inside the enclosure, Mike lifted his chin and made the first full howl Elena had ever heard from him. A real howl, an adult howl, carrying everything he was, in one sustained sound that rose from his chest and went up into the October sky. Micah howled a beat after him. Stram last, with his own distinct voice, slightly rougher and more complex. 3 voices going up, 15 voices coming down, the sounds meeting somewhere above the tree line, above the mountain, in the cold, clear air of the October morning. Elena stood at the fence with her hands at her sides and did not move. Ada, on the laptop on the fence post, was completely silent for the entire duration. Radu was not silent. He made a sound that was not a word, and that Elena chose not to look at because she knew if she looked at him she would lose the composure she was maintaining, and she wanted to watch this moment clearly without anything blurring it. The howling lasted for 4 minutes and 30 seconds, which she timed not for scientific purposes, but because it seemed like the kind of thing that should be timed, that the duration should be known. Then it faded, and the morning resumed its normal texture, the cold, the sky, the pines. Elena opened the enclosure gate. The 3 wolves walked through the open gate. They walked, not ran, walked, with the considered, careful movement of animals that understand the weight of what they are stepping into. Mike went first, his nose low, reading the ground at the forest's edge. Then Micah, a step behind him. Then Stram, with his rolling gait, his body carrying its characteristic adjustment without effort or apology. They reached the tree line and paused. All 3 of them, at the same moment, as if the tree line were a threshold that required acknowledgement before crossing. Then Mike went in. Then Micah. Then Stram, rolling gait and all, disappeared into the pines. For a long moment there was nothing. Then the sound of running came from the forest, the specific percussion of large paws on cold ground, moving fast, moving with the reaching stride of something that has found the right ground under its feet for the first time, and is not wasting a moment, moving deeper, moving up, moving toward the sound that was still faintly echoing in Elena's memory, though the howling had stopped minutes ago. Then nothing. Just the forest, doing what the forest does, holding what it holds. The wildlife observer looked at Elena. He had the expression of a man who has witnessed something he will be telling people about for the rest of his life, but who does not yet have the words for it. He opened his mouth. He closed it. He tried again. He said, "In 14 years." Elena nodded. She understood. She did not have the words for it either, not right now. They would come. She would find them in the notebook, the way she always found things. Radu had stopped trying not to cry and had given it up as impractical, which she found entirely correct under the circumstances. Ada on the laptop screen was very still and very quiet in the specific way she was still and quiet when something had reached her deeply, and she was processing it internally rather than externally. Dr. Bogdan was writing in his notebook. He was the most professional person there, which Elena expected of him and for which she was grateful. The scientific record needed someone to be writing in it right now, and she could not be that person at this moment. And then, from the temporary pen beside the enclosure, Nina howled. It was the first real howl she had produced, not the thin, exploratory sound she had occasionally made in the cabin, but a full howl, a real one, produced by a real wolf who has found the call within herself and sent it out into the world. It rose from the pen and went up into the October air, and it was her voice, completely her own voice, and it went up to meet the forest above and whatever was moving through it. The forest did not answer. The pack was too far in now, too deep in their own mourning. But the howl went up anyway, and was complete in itself, and Elena stood beside the pen and listened to it, and felt the full weight of everything that had happened on this mountain in the past 13 months press against the back of her eyes, in a way she had been managing for an hour, and could not manage any longer. She let it go. She stood at Nina's pen, and cried in the cold October morning, with the mountains around her, and the forest above her, and the wildlife officer, pretending not to notice, and Radu not pretending at all, and Nina's howl, fading slowly into the clear air. She did not cry for long enough, and when she was done she wiped her face and opened Nina's pen and went inside, and knelt in the straw and put her arms around the wolf's large warm neck. Nina stood quietly and let herself be held, which was one of the things she did that no wolf raised entirely in the wild would ever do, and which was not a deficiency but a truth about what she was. Something shaped by both worlds, belonging entirely to neither, and finding in that particular condition a life that was genuinely her own. Elena held on for a moment, then she sat back on her heels and looked at Nina. She said, "All right, here we are." It was what she had said to Mike, 9 months ago, on the morning he had walked across the cabin floor on unsteady legs, and sat down in front of her, and looked up at her face. It was what she seemed to say when something true and significant had been arrived at, and there was nothing to do but acknowledge it. Nina regarded her with those dark amber eyes. She did not say anything, being a wolf. But her tail made one slow sweep, and she stayed close, and the morning continued around them, and the mountain held them in it the way it held everything, without preference, without distinction, with the enormous patient indifference that had come to feel, over the course of this year, less like indifference, and more like a very deep kind of freedom. That evening, Radu drove down to the village for the night, and Mihai and Dr. Bogdan sat at the table in the cabin with Elena, and the three of them ate a late dinner that Mihai cooked, badly, but with effort, and drank a small amount of the plum brandy he had brought from Bucharest, and talked not about the science but about other things, about the mountain, about what Elena was going to do next, about the weather that was coming, and the winter ahead, and what the pack would sound like from the cabin on the first hard, cold night. Elena said she was going to stay. She was going to stay for another winter, and probably after that. She was going to finish the memoir she had started in the green notebook. She was going to be here when the paper was published, and when the responses came in, and when the follow-up work needed doing, because there was follow-up work to do, and she was the one who knew this mountain, and this pack, and this particular old wolf better than anyone. Mihai said, "He may not be there for much longer." She said, "I know." He said, "Old wolves." She said, "I know, Mihai." He nodded. He did not say anything else about it. He poured another small amount of brandy, and raised his glass, and she raised hers, and Dr. Bogdan raised his, and they sat in the warm cabin, in the quiet of the October evening, with Nina asleep in the corner, and the fire in the stove, and the mountain outside, continuing to be exactly what it was. She had one more letter to write that night. Not to Mihai, not to Ada, not to any of the colleagues who had become part of the work. A letter she would not send. She had been writing letters she did not send since Daniel died. Not diary entries, not journal entries, but actual letters, addressed, full of news, written the way she had written to him when he was studying abroad for a year, and email had felt too casual for what she wanted to say. She sat at the table after Mihai and Dr. Bogdan had gone to bed on their respective mattresses, and she wrote to Daniel. She told him about the morning. She told him about the howling and the gate and the 3 wolves going into the trees. She told him about Nina's howl going up into the October air. She told him what the wildlife officer had said, and what Radu had done, and what Ada's face had looked like on the laptop screen. She told him about Regula, at the fence on the day of his visit to the enclosure, the tail moving once, the acknowledgement of Stram's gate, the decision she had watched him make in real time. She told him, "You were right. They were telling us something. All this time, they were telling us something, and the telling required someone who could be still enough and attentive enough to receive it. I am sorry it took me so long to understand what kind of receiving was required." She folded the letter and put it in the back of the green notebook with all the others. Then she went to bed, and the mountain held the dark and the forest and the wolves moving through it. And in the morning, there would be new camera footage to review, and a world to document and work to do. And she was going to do all of it, and it was going to be enough. It was going to be more than enough. It was going to be the work of the rest of her life, and the rest of her life was going to be lived on this mountain, where an old silver wolf had decided, after months of careful consideration, that she was exactly the right person to trust with what mattered most to him. She had decided he was right. The hare appeared on her doorstep 2 mornings after the release. She found it at first light, on a Thursday in late October, in the pale cold before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. She had opened the door as she always did, early, before making tea, to let the night air out of the cabin and the morning air in, and to take the temperature of the day with her face, before she had to use words about it. She looked down. The hare was positioned at the center of the threshold, not dropped, not tossed, not left carelessly. Placed. Arranged the way you arrange something you have brought deliberately and want to present correctly. It was whole, undamaged, recently caught. She stood in the doorway for a long time. She knew what it was. She knew before she picked it up, before she turned it over, before she stood in the pale morning with it in her hands and let the knowledge of it fully arrive. She was a wildlife biologist. She had spent 30 years studying the behavior of large predators. She knew what it meant when a wolf left food. She knew the circumstances under which that behavior occurred. Provisioning, the term the literature used, the transfer of food resources to individuals within the social network. Wolves did not provision humans. This was not an assumption or a cultural belief. It was a documented fact of the biological literature, consistent across all studies of wild wolf behavior, in all populations that had been studied. The behavior did not occur. It was not in the records. She had, in 30 years, read hundreds of papers and monographs and field reports on wolf social behavior, and the provisioning of human individuals by wild wolves was not a thing she had encountered in any of them. What she was holding was not a thing that happened. She stood at the threshold with the hare in her hands, and she looked out at the tree line. Regale was there. One last time, standing at the western edge of the pines in his usual spot, looking at the cabin with those amber gold eyes. He was silver in the morning light, the way he was always silver in the morning light, and he was very still, and he was looking at her. She looked at him. She thought about 30 years of field work and the discipline of staying on the right side of the line between what evidence supports and what the human mind wants to believe. She thought about peer review and the standard of proof and the careful language she and Mihai and Ada had used for months to describe, precisely, what the cameras had shown and what the evidence supported and what it did not. She thought about Daniel, who had said that animals were telling people things, and about her own correction, and about being wrong. She thought about what it meant to receive a gift, not in the human sense, not with all the social complexity that word carries in human contexts, but in the most basic sense, the transfer of something of value from one being to another, freely given, without transaction. The gift as an expression of something that exists between two beings, and that exceeds what language can easily contain. She raised her eyes from the hare to Regale. She said, "Thank you." She said it clearly, without hesitation, without apology for the fact that it was an inadequate response to an inadequate moment, or rather an adequate response to an extraordinary one, which was the same thing. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he lowered his great gray head in the gesture she had spent a year learning to recognize, the brief, almost imperceptible inclination that was neither a nod nor a bow, but something uniquely his, the only formal gesture in his vocabulary with her, used only for moments that required acknowledgement. He raised his head, he turned, he walked into the forest. She stood at the threshold until the pines had taken him back and the tree line was empty, and the morning was simply a morning again, cold and clear, and full of its own business. Then she looked down at what was in her hands. She called Mihai from the village that afternoon. She told him what she had found, and where, and what she had seen at the tree line. She described it factually, in the order it had happened, with the precision that was her native language. She heard his breathing change on the line. He said, "The cameras." She said, "I did not check before I called you. I wanted to tell you first." A pause. He said, "Wolves do not provision humans." She said, "I know." He said, "Elena." She said, "I know, Mihai." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need you to tell me exactly what you did with it." She said, "I buried it." Another pause, longer this time. She said, "I know what you are thinking. I know it should have been documented more thoroughly. I know it should have been photographed before I handled it and placed in a controlled environment, and the cameras should have been checked immediately for prior footage. I know all of that." He said, "Why did you bury it?" She thought about this. She had thought about it for hours since the morning. She said, "Because it was a gift, and gifts should be returned to the earth." He did not respond immediately. She could hear him thinking through the phone line, the specific quality of Mihai's thinking, which she had been able to hear for 18 years. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes, all right." She said, "The cameras will have what they have. The moment was what it was." He said, "I know." She said, "I am going to put it in the paper." He said, "I know you are." She said, "We will write it the way it needs to be written. Careful language, clear acknowledgement of what it cannot prove, but we will put it in." He said, "Yes." She walked back up the mountain. The afternoon was very clear, the sky an impossible blue above the pines, and the air had the mineral sharpness of true October in the Carpathians. The cold, that means the season is done, pretending to be anything other than what it is. She walked with her hands in her pockets, and her face toward the ridge, and the specific clean weight of having done the right thing settling through her like warmth. She had buried the hair under the pine tree at the eastern edge of the yard, the one that was tallest, the one whose roots had grown into the stones of the old wall along the yard's edge, the one that had been there long before the cabin and would be there long after. She had buried it without ceremony but with attention, the way you attend to a thing that deserves attending to. Then she had stood beside the tree for a while and looked at the ground and thought about gifts. Now she walked up the mountain and came in through the cabin door, and Nina was there, in the corner where she usually was in the afternoon, and raised her head when Elena came in. Elena sat down on the floor, the way she had been sitting on the floor of this cabin since March, since the first morning, since Mike had put his muzzle in a bowl and come out sneezing, and the specific shape of this year had first become visible. Nina came across the room and put her head in Elena's lap. Elena set her hand on the wolf's head. She looked at the photograph of Daniel on the shelf, the boy with the frog, the grin that had never changed in the 11 years she had been looking at it. She said, "He did not come back to the tree line after that morning. The cameras confirmed it later. When I checked, he was there at 4:18 in the morning, before I woke, and that was the last recording of him at the western tree line. Not the northern, not the southern, the western edge, where he had been standing since November of the year before." She was not speaking to Daniel. She was not speaking to Nina. She was speaking to the year, to the record of it, assembling in her own voice the account of how it had ended. Writers, she had been told by the people who published her academic work, should know where their stories end. She had not always agreed with this advice. She was beginning to understand it now. She had checked the cameras that evening, 32 appearances at the western tree line, over 13 months, and then nothing. The pack continued to pass through the territory. The subadults appeared occasionally at the tree line, the way subadults will when something about an area interests them. But Regale was gone from the footage. George had told her, when she went down to the village in November, and told him what she had seen. An old wolf goes to the deep places when it is time, not to die, not necessarily, or not yet, but to be out of the sight of people, out of the areas of crossover. They go back to being purely themselves. She had thought about this. She had thought about it in the context of everything she knew professionally, and in the context of everything she had come to know about this particular wolf specifically. She thought about what it might mean for a creature to complete a significant thing, to carry it to its end, to stand at the threshold where it was done, and acknowledge that it was done, and then to turn back toward its own world. Not a death, a completion. She was not certain of this. She had written in the paper, carefully. No subsequent direct observation of the alpha male was made after the date of the final gift, and no camera captures have confirmed his presence in the study area as of the time of writing. His current status is unknown. She had written it that way because it was the truth of what she knew and what she did not know, and she was not going to fill the gap in her knowledge with anything she could not prove. But in the notebook, in the back pages, she had written what she believed. She had written, "He finished what he started. He brought me the pups and watched me bring them through, and stood at the fence, and confirmed what would happen to them, and came back 2 mornings later, and left something that meant, 'This account between us is complete, and the completion is good.' Then he went back. I think that is what happened. I think that is exactly what happened, and I think I will spend a long time understanding what it means." She was still spending that long time. She expected to spend the rest of her life on it. That winter was different from the first winter. Not easier, not softer. The Carpathian winters did not offer those adjustments, and she would not have wanted them if they had. But different in texture. She woke in the mornings with the specific purposefulness of someone who has work, and knows what the work is, and wants to get to it. She went to the table and opened the green notebook. She wrote for 2 or 3 hours. Then she fed Nina and checked the cameras and made notes and attended to the mountain and the day. The paper was published in January, 47 pages. 47 pages of the most careful language she had ever committed to print, with 16 pages of supplementary materials and 12 selected minutes of camera footage embedded in the digital version, and 4 reviewers who had all said, in different words, that they had never encountered anything quite like it. The response was what Mihai had predicted, a wide range, from fascinated to deeply skeptical, with a substantial middle ground of scientists who said clearly that they could not account for the evidence within existing frameworks and were therefore reserving judgment and looking forward to follow-up work. This was the correct scientific response to genuinely unprecedented evidence, and she respected it. There were also letters from people who were not scientists, from people who had read about the paper in newspapers and in the kind of online coverage that scientific work occasionally generated, and who wrote to say that the story had meant something to them that they wanted to articulate. A woman who had lost a child, a man who had come back from a long illness, a retired teacher who had lived alone on a farm for 20 years, and who said that she had always known that the animals around her were paying attention in ways that people underestimated, and that it was good to have the evidence. Elena read each of these letters and wrote back to each one. She had not expected to do this, had not expected the letters, had not considered that a scientific paper about wolf behavior would reach people in the way these letters described. But it had, and the letters required a response, and she gave them one. The memoir was finished by spring of the following year. It was not a long book. It was the right length for what it had to say, which was the only length that mattered. She sent it to a publisher, Mihai's wife recommended, and they accepted it, and it came out the following autumn, and people read it. She was still on the mountain. She would stay on the mountain. Nina was there, and the pack was above her, and the work was ongoing, and the notebooks were filling, and the cameras were still in the tree line, and the spring was coming, in the slow way that spring comes at altitude, grudgingly at first, and then all at once. On a morning in March, a year after the first pup had appeared on her doorstep, Elena opened the cabin door at first light. She looked at the threshold. She stood for a moment in the doorway and breathed the cold, clean air and looked at the empty step. Then she went inside and made tea and sat at the table and opened the green notebook. She wrote, "Year 2. The mountain is exactly itself. The pack is on the ridge. Nina is asleep in the corner. The cameras are running. The work continues." She paused. Then she wrote, "I came here to disappear. I was found instead. I have been trying, ever since, to understand the difference, and every morning I understand it a little better." She closed the notebook. She picked up her pen again and opened it to the same page. She added one more line. She wrote, "Today is a good day to pay attention." Then she set the pen down and picked up her tea and sat in the good warm cabin on the mountain, where she had come to set everything down, and where, instead, everything had been given back to her in a form she had not been able to anticipate and could not now imagine living without. Outside, from the ridge, a single howl rose, just one voice, young and tentative and trying out the shape of the sound. One of the new ones, she thought, one of the ones born this winter, finding its voice on the mountain, the way things find themselves here, by the simple, patient, unglamorous practice of being present to what is in front of them, and attending to it with everything they have. She listened until it faded. Then she went to work.